Hello and welcome to MoonCon 25, the Welsh Goddess Edition. We have an amazing lineup for you today. 4 speakers, 4 goddesses, and a Q&A session. We're going to kick off in just a second with Brett Hollyhead. He's talking about the wonderful river goddess Sabrina. Then we have Mhara Starling with Branwen. Trying my pronunciations here. Followed by Jhenah Telyndru with Rhiannon. And then finally, Kristoffer Hughes with Arianrhod. Amazing speakers, wonderful subjects. And then finally at 8 o'clock, we'll have all 4 speakers doing a bit of a discussion and a Q&A session. What's not to love, really? Streaming live, please do feel free to ask questions, type them in the comments, and we'll ask the questions at the end. It is being recorded, so you can watch it on replay as well, but we'd love for you to stick with us live because then you get to ask the questions as well. So if technology favours us, we're going to get the party started and welcome Brett Hollyhead. Welcome.
Hi, you okay?
Yeah, hi, it's working.
Oh, praise the gods.
Yes, we pray to the technology gods. Brilliant. So Brett's going to be talking about Sabrina. I'm going to disappear from your screens and let Brett do the talking because he's the one that knows all the stuff. I will hand it over to you, Brett. Have fun with it.
Oh, thank you. I think I need a bit of fun, to be fair, because I've just had the whole entire hassle trying to work my computer. I am very technologically inept, but I think I can panic over now. I should have a shot of whiskey here just to keep me going. Bit of Dutch courage.
You're here. As long as you're here, that's fine.
Absolutely,
right.
I'm here.
I will leave you to it and catch you in a bit.
Brilliant, thank you. All right, then. So I'm just going to share my screen and get my presentation up. Hopefully I can get the right one. Chrome tabs, window. It doesn't seem to want to pull up my presentation. So you know what? I might just do this freehand, Just give me 2 seconds, see if I can try and screen share it in my window. Chrome tab. There we go. There it is. Give me 2 seconds. Share screen. Oh, bit of a spoiler there for you. Perfect. Present and present full screen. Hopefully everyone can see this, I hope. If not, I'm sure Rachel will let me know in the conversation. Right then, so without further ado, let's get started. So hi everyone, thank you so much for joining me today, and it is an absolute honour to be part of MoonCon 2025. And today I'll be talking about the mystical goddess Havren, or as she's formerly known as Sabrina. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Brett and I'm a Welsh Marches practicing folk witch who grew up on both sides of the river. As a young child, I grew up both in Shropshire with my mum and in a place called Drenewydd with my father in Wales, or Powys in the county of Wales. So basically I was passed left, right, back and centre more times than a yo-yo over the river itself. So she was very much part of my culture, she was very much part of my childhood and my upbringing. And in this talk today, I want to specifically focus on her mythology, her folklore and her history, and the multiple trajectories she has taken to become the goddess that we know today, especially through the process of apotheosis, in which she can be seen to embody the goddess of transformation, of sovereignty, of boundaries, and of course, environmental consciousness, especially in the modern age. So we'll be talking about all that together as well, and we'll also be exploring her unique connection as well to grand Welsh mythology itself, because when we talk about Welsh deities, specifically those within the modern-day Welsh pantheon, a lot of them do have their foundation within the text, such as the Mabinogi. But Sabrina is a little bit different because she doesn't quite fall into that structure of the Mabinogi. In fact, she's not basically mentioned by name in there, but nevertheless she plays such a prevalent part both in the shaping of the landscape as well as in the trajectory of the people and how they inhabit that space and how they interact with the river itself. So let's get straight stuck into it. So, for those of you who may not know, Sabrina is categorized as the goddess of the longest river in Britain, which is the River Severn. So, as you'll see, there's a map here. It flows all the way from the middle of Wales, from the Cambrian Mountains, for 220 miles. And there she flows through the Welsh Marches counties. So, as you see on the map, she starts in a place called Plyn Limon Fawr, or that's the main place. And from there, she goes through the Welsh towns and markets. So we've got Llanidloes, Newtown or Drenewydd, which is where I spent most of my time as a child, and then through Welshpool, making her way through into the counties of Shropshire, Worcestershire, and right down into Gloucestershire before she ends her journey at the Bristol Channel, which is also known as Mor Hafren or Hafren Sea. So, as you can see, she's a mighty, expansive river that she extends all the way through the different landscapes, coalescing all different types of people together to form one unity, I suppose. In fact, colloquially known, the people that inhabit the banks of the River Severn are formerly known as the Sabrina folk, which is a really cute name that we grew up with. Especially for me, I was always known as Sabrina folk as a child. And when we look to her waters, we see a whole range of folklore and stories that have been emulated from these waters since the beginning of time. And many of them shape around the ideas of tragedy, of melancholy, of magic, and of course of powerful kingdoms and of ruin. So we have a heavily amount of mysticism involved with the water of the Severn, but also that with tragedy, especially from the age of conquest. As we look through history, this specific landscape itself, known as the Welsh Marches, has been heavily invaded. It's been heavily conquered by different forms of people coming in, such as the Norman. And we'll talk a bit like that later and how that fuels into her mythos. The River Severn is also known to have the highest second tidal bore in the whole entire world. It is absolutely magnificent. And those who are in the vicinity of that, the Severn, will go and surf on it, even though it is very known to be quite dangerous. In the 8th century, the clerical monk known as Nennius described it as one of the many wonders of Britain. And he described it as Dau Rhy Hafren, or the two kings of the Severn. And basically what that means is that these two kings, who took the form of mighty rams in the sea foam of the Severn Bore, would clash back and forth together over and over and over. So it kind of emulates the idea of conquest and of battlement and fighting as well. And in a way, I like to perceive it from my own personal notice as they are fighting over the affection of the river itself, emulating the very various fights between the English and Welsh as they have subjugated through years and years of conquest. But when we look throughout history, where does the veneration of this river come from? And we know that water itself is perceived as this primordial sacred element, which has been venerated throughout history, especially across multiple waterscapes, whether that be lakes, the sea, and especially through rivers. Rivers in particular play an important role, especially within the Celtic continuum, because they are seen as the bridges to the otherworld. They delineate the boundaries between our physical realm and that of the supernatural, I suppose, as you want to call it. So they are the boundary in which they cross over. And most of the time, you'll find the presence of the otherworld comes in through very auspicious times of year, or the Ysbrydnos. So that's Calan Mai, Calan Gaeaf, and Nos Goelifan, or May Day, Halloween, and St. John's Eve, or Midsummer. And when we look throughout history, what archaeological evidence do we have that pertains to the veneration of the Severn? Well, we know that it had an intrinsic part, especially within the Celtic people and in their belief system, because we know that they had animistic beliefs that surrounded the world around them. But we also have archaeological deposits. So these were venerational deposits, such as swords and axes and shields, that were thrown into the river in order to make a venerational deposit to show either gratitude or to propitiate the deity itself. So this could be to help show the gratitude for the life-giving and nourishing qualities that they give to the community, but also to stave off those temperamental and destructive qualities. As many people know, when it comes to rivers, as much as they are this bountiful, life-giving sources of wisdom and of creation, they can also destroy it within a blink of an eye. And growing up near the River Severn myself, I have been quite the victim, to be fair, to Sabrina's temperamental nature. She's flooded the place left, right, and centre and left devastation in the ruin. But as we can see, the river itself plays that very important part in the aspects of life, death, and rebirth. Where destruction comes, life can be reborn. So it has that aspects of the irrigation of the landscape itself to bring forth new life. But when we look, like I said, to the Welsh pantheon, Sabrina herself has fallen short. She's often been overlooked or neglected in some instances because not many people know about her. Because when it comes to other Welsh deities, they have that textual source that people can relate to, such as the Mabinogi, which was written down between the 12th and the 14th centuries, and we have that preserved in the manuscripts as part of Wales's oldest collection of tales. But when we come to Sabrina, we do have tales that are connected to her, but then she has a more nebulous origin, which I hope I can shed an illumination on today and hopefully enchant people to look more into the depths of her water. Because she's a very important deity who's sometimes perceived through the physicality of her river herself, but she also plays a fundamental role in shaping the culture of the landscape itself, specifically against the idea of homogenization when it comes to British identity. So, as I've mentioned before, Sabrina herself, although she starts off in Wales, can often be described as a Welsh Marches deity. But what exactly is the Welsh Marches? And for those who have heard me speak about Wales before will instantly know that I tend to talk a lot about the Welsh Marches, so much so that people may roll their eyes over me and think, oh my god, not again. But when I talk about the Welsh Marches, we're talking about an imprecisely defined area of land that is formulated between England and Wales. So we're talking about the east counties of Wales and the western counties of England. And it forms almost out of a hinterland, a very liminal landscape that is distinct both in its culture and its people and its history, distinct and unique away from the rest of Britain, in fact. And this is because of its liminal aspects to it. So the Welsh March itself, also known as the Borders or Gororau in Welsh, was known throughout time as the March of Walier. So the Welsh March itself was established in the 11th century after the Norman invasion. So William the Conqueror came over in 1066, and after he defeated Harold at the Battle of Hastings, oh my god, my history lessons are coming in now, he made his way down and he subjugated that land. He conquered Wales through the establishment of Marcher Lords, and they specifically took precedent both in Cheshire, in Shropshire and Hereford. But the Welsh Marches itself became almost a hinterland, as I said. It was a hybridization of Welsh and English. So they were independent in their jurisdiction and in their economical value, as well as in their ruling. So the English king didn't necessarily have sovereign over these lands. So they were the in-between between England and Wales. And it's very much reflected in the people today of themselves. A lot of people who live within this landscape, and including myself, will often have a mixed family of English and Welsh, and will often have a bias towards one or the other. So me speaking, I have more of a bias towards Welsh, as I grew up within a Welsh family and English family as well. And I spent half my time growing up in Wales, whereas other people will feel more of an affinity towards England and English culture. But nevertheless, this land is distinctive both in its geography and its topography, because you'll find that there is a dense concentration of motte and bailey castles that reflect this history of conquest and subjugation. But it also rings true to the idea of borders, and that borders are nothing more than just administrative fallacies that are placed in line to try and contain something that cannot necessarily be truly contained. As we all know, culture, folklore, mythology expands way beyond the idea of borders, and it doesn't necessarily reflect the aspects of the people. So when I talk about Havren or Sabrina, keep that in mind when it talks about the Welsh Marches, and just to see how paradoxical she is in that she is both Welsh and English and neither at the same time. So where exactly does she come from? Now, there are multiple ways that we can see where the history of the goddess can stem from, and one of them is through etymology. So Sabrina herself comes first recorded in the 2nd century by Ptolemy, as he was categorizing the Celtic tribes during the Roman occupation, and he records her as Sabrina Fluvius, the river as Sabrina Fluvius, and this is later validated by Tacitus, who names her as Sabrinam. Now, we don't exactly know where this name came from, but it is theorized to be that the name Sabrina was already in the Roman arsenal as they came over, conquering the lands of Europe before they arrived in Britain. And we have evidence of a certain river in the village of Dostal by the Karabodak River in modern-day Turkey, bearing the name Sabrina. And therefore, that name might have been integrated into their pocket already. And by the time they came over into Britain and met with the Brythonic-speaking people, or the Celtic people, that name could have been mixed and maybe replaced the original name for the deity that they had for that river. Although, when we look to the Welsh sources, however, the name Havrin appears, which is a very beautiful name, because when we divide it down into etymology, the word have means summer, and ren is more of a moving suffix. So it almost can be taken to mean a relation to the migration of the summertime. So it could be the idea of the summertime representing the vitality of the earth, and somehow the River Severn would have played a very important aspect in the lives of the Brythonic people. Or when we look further back into time, we see that the name Havren would have came from Middle Welsh to be Habren, and then before then it would have been Sabre or Sabren, as the S developed into the H during the development of the Welsh language. When you look towards her name, especially on Wikipedia, you'll find that the name Samarosina comes up to mean land of the summertime flow. But there's only one source that attests to that. But in recent evidence and in recent recent discovery, it is theorized that her name comes from Sam Beruina, she of the waters foaming together. So that's very much in relation to the seven boar as well, the waters that foam together, which is a more accurate description of what her name could have mean. And even then, she has another name, which is Unla, which was given to her by the Saxons to mean misfortune in 577, as many of the Saxon people drowned in her river as they tried to invade and take over the native Briton people. So she has many, many names to choose from. Of which you just pick one, to be fair, but no, it just goes to show how multifaceted this goddess is. And as I said before, throughout history, we do have very limited archaeology in terms of what we can perceive to be Havrin or Sabrina, as there are no temples, there are no shrines erected to her. But what we do have is the coalescence of very different figures who have come together to underpin the foundation of the goddess we have today. In terms of Sabrina, she is more of a modernized deity that comes from the 12th century, but when we look to the past history before then, we see these different figures attached to the River Severn. So, for example, we have Modron, the Divine Mother, who is found in the tale of Killoch and Olwen, whose son is stolen from her and imprisoned in Caerloy or modern-day Gloucestershire. And in that tale as well, we come across another figure, which is the Salmon of Llenllu, or the Salmon of Wisdom, who embodies the greatest knowledge of the river itself. And of course, later on, through the writings of Stephen Yeats, we have a figure known as Matador Buna, who is seen as this all-encompassing mother figure who is represented by the symbolic correspondence of the cauldron relating to the landscape of the Severn Vale, which could have seen to be the presiding deity over that landscape, specifically attached to the River Severn. And then later on, of course, we have Henwen, the magical piggy, who emerges from the River Severn herself to give blessings down to South Wales before she makes her way up to North Wales, and of course causes mass devastation to the landscape through bearing such burdens to the landscape. So she gives birth to the Cath Palig, which is this giant cat that causes ruin wherever it goes. And then later on, through the domination of Christianity, we have the attachment of the Virgin Mary to the river, as we have about over 50 churches linked to the river. So there very much is this idea of this maternal figure being related to the Severn that may or may not have coalesced to form the modern day underpinnings of the data we have today. But in terms of archaeological evidence, we do have one, or I say a couple, that it kind of relates to more of a masculine presenting deity known as Nodens. Now, he is specifically located down in Lydney Park in Gloucestershire. This was a maritime deity who was associated with the dreamscape, in which many people would flock to his temple in order to receive healing through dreaming. They would placate the deity Nodens in order to receive his healing for their ailments. And this later one would have translated through the literary tradition as Neith, to mean mist, and later on as Llydd, or Llydd Llaw Eriant, who later on appears in the Mabinogion. So we do see the River Severn in some way, shape or form attached to the mythologies of Wales itself, but it doesn't necessarily mention the name Sabrina. Again, the name Neith later relates to another deity in Welsh mythology, so Gwyn ap Neith, Gwyn the son of mist. And we also have strong connections to the Mabinogi as well. So even though I said Sabrina doesn't necessarily appear in the Mabinogi, that doesn't mean the River Severn doesn't appear, and it still has that attachment to the other world. So those who may be familiar with the first branch, I won't go into too much, I know other speakers will be talking about it in much greater detail than I will know that in the first branch, there is a figure known as Tiernan, and in the story, his foals are taken in the same way that Pryderi is taken away from Rhiannon and Pwyll. They're taken away by this strange, mysterious claw that emerges from the otherworld and takes away these foals. And that in itself has been theorized to be the raging boar itself, that otherworldly boar coming out of the water to snatch away life and to pull it back into the waters. And when we look to Tiernan's name, Lord of the Raging Boar, we see that fluvial connection to the water and the River Severn. But when we talk about Sabrina herself, her mythos comes to us from Geoffrey of Monmouth, specifically in his writings known as The History of the Kings of Britain in 1136. Now, we don't exactly know where he got this tale from, but it is argued that it came from a mysterious book that was given to him by the Walter, Archdeacon of Oxford. Unfortunately, that book has never been found. But we have the story still recorded to this day that has been used to show the mythology of the goddess and where she originated from. And in that tale, which he refers to as Habrim, she emerges as the daughter of the King of England, who was born as the bastardized love child of the King of England, Lochranus, and his lover Estrodus, who was a Germanic princess. The only problem was that Lochranus was betrothed already to a woman called Gwendolen, and when she found out, she was enraged. Hell have no fury like a woman scorned. Not only did she raise an army to go kill her husband, she managed to find Estrodus and her daughter and drown them both in the water. But that wasn't the end of her vengeance. To add insult to injury, she later named the River Severn after the daughter as an everlasting symbol of her husband's infidelity. And growing up as a child, when I first heard them tales, I used to think, oh my God, she was an evil woman, what a wicked stepmother. But now in the modern day, I kind of like, you know what, more power to her. He had what was coming, you know what I mean? It's a fabulous, fabulous tale that shows just how striking the landscape is in terms of that mythology, because it is said that that drowning happened in a place called Dolvorwyn, or Maiden's Meadow, which you can pass today. So it's very much related to the landscape and how that river, although is seen as mystical throughout the Celtic period, it only got attached towards this idea of Havrin in the 12th century, the idea that it is attached to innocence, and how it is always the innocent who pay for the crimes of those in authority. A very pertinent lesson. But that's not the only tale that we have of Sabrina. So when we look to more Welsh folklore, we find in the writings of Bill Gwilym and John Rhys a different mythos altogether, one that is heavily connected to the natural cycles of the hydrological cycle, or specifically where rain comes from. And it is a very beautiful tale. So in the tale, we have a giant known as Pim Lemon, and as he walks the landscape, he cries 3 tears out of desperation for the desolate lands that surround him. And from those 3 tears, 3 great beautiful nymphs are born. So these are Havrin, Rheidol, and Gwy. Sometimes Rheidol is interchanged with Ystwyth, but the original pretends to Rheidol. And as they grew stronger each day, they yearned to be joined with the Celtic Sea. And one day they left their father to bring life and nourishment to the landscape themselves, with Rheidol being the first to reach the sea, and Gwy taking her time to go down the tranquil landscape of the southern part of Wales. Havrin, however, was infatuated with the kingdoms of people, and she went there to learn the ways as well as to bestow her own wisdom, with the warning that if they ever reproach her, she would flood them. And to this day, that tale has remained true. And as the sisters converge together and tell each other of their tales, they ride upon the clouds to go visit their father again, to restart the cycle back forth. And that's a really beautiful tale, because a lot of people ask, what is the point of learning about Sabrina when she's so localized and so specifically connected to the topography of the land? And as I said to people, it doesn't matter whether she is connected to the River Severn. This tale shows that she is expansive in her lore and that she is connected to rain. And whenever the area is rain, you are in the presence of divinity. After all, water is primordial and sacred. And so when we're in the presence of water, we are in the presence of something that connects everyone around this world. After all, we're all 70% water. So wherever we are, the goddess is with us too. Later on, Sabrina went through a huge transformation during the early modern period, specifically through the poets who reawoke her in order to try and change her story to fit their political aspects. So when I talked about her being the front of political homogenization, this is very much true in this period. So during this period, we have King James VI of Scotland and the First of England, and his attempt to unify England and Scotland. And of course, not everyone was on board on this. In fact, even stemming from the Tudor period up to the Stuart period, there was a lot of political fragmentation. People were losing faith in the sovereign crown. And in order to counteract that, the kings and the queens of that time period were often utilising Welsh mythology as a sort of propaganda to try and reinstate their rule over the land. And we see that through the Tudor period, through King Henry VII invoking the name Mab Darogan, or the son of prophecy. But when we come to King James's period, we see a writer known as Michael Drayton, who wrote the piece called Polly Olbion in 1612. And in this, he describes Sabrina as a motherly goddess figure who presides over the landscape, who commands a retinue of nymphs. And in this, she is seen as being the mediator of a dispute between the English and Welsh over the ownership of Lundy Island. And over time, she says that the land belongs to both of you. But later on, as she sees as this homogenization of British identity comes to its close, she suffers under the grief that Wales has suffered under the subjugation of England. And until the ancient wrongs are righted, then this will no longer be part of her identity. She cannot give forth that aspect of British identity. It must remain Welsh. It must be captured by the idea of Welsh sovereignty. And when we look to Michael Drayton's work, we see a little note that places like Shropshire, Hereford, and Chester should be returned back to their ancient mother, and that the wrongs should be righted. So Sabrina attests against that. But the most famous example that we have of Sabrina comes to us in 1633 through the writings of Comus in a masque in honour of chastity. So Sabrina is stripped of any kind of pagan aspect, and she is seen as this virginal nymph, beautiful and chaste. And in this story, she rescues a woman who is captured by an evil sorcerer who is quite debaucherous and hedonistic. And through this, we have the most famous invocation of Sabrina, which is inscribed on many of the statues in the landscape, as well as in modern day practice. And of course, that goes a little something like this. Sabrina fair, listen where thou art sitting, under the glassy cool translucent waves, in twisted braids of lilies knitting, the loose train of thy amber dropping hair. Listen for dear honour's sake, goddess of the silver lake, listen and save. And so through the story, she rescues a lady who's been captured by this evil, mysterious sorcerer. And from there, she emulates the idea of chastity and of virtue, which, of course, is not necessarily akin to a pagan deity. And it was very much the Christian aspects of that time period being stamped onto the goddess. But it shows how powerful of a protectress that she is, and that those who call out to the goddess in warbled song will have their prayers listened to. And that's still found within folklore today when people visit the River Severn during liminal times and call out to her. Sometimes people will see her in the modern day folklore as appearing upon a chariot being pulled by salmon and dolphins, and that she will answer the call of those who especially are oppressed or are marginalised. She is always there listening. And then later on, Sabrina enters into modern day folklore, and she even emigrates over into America into the 19th century, so she doesn't necessarily just stay put. But I think I'm coming close to my time to try and stay close. If anyone does have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them at the very end. And I'm very, very happy to answer that as well. But I think just to briefly show you what I mean when she emigrated over into America, this is what I mean specifically here, that she emigrated to Massachusetts. So if anyone does have any questions relating to the American identity of Sabrina, I'm very much happy to answer those. And those of you, of course, a shameless plug, who are interested in the goddess, I do have my book, which has just been released, Pagan Port of Sabrina, which is available for all retailers. But diolch yn fawr for listening to me, and I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope I wasn't too fast. It's very hard to try and condense it all down. Oh, I can breathe now. Woo!
Brilliant.
Oh, thank you.
That was very impressive. Fascinating information. She is an amazing deity, and one that not very many people seem to know about either. So it's good that she's being put out there. Definitely.
Absolutely.
So we thank you, Brett. We will say goodbye to you now, but we will see you back again at 8 o'clock for the questions and answers. So if anybody's got any questions, pop them in the comments and we will throw them unceremoniously to Brett in the Q&A. You can go and have a little lie down for a minute now, Brett.
Oh, God, I'm going to need it.
Brilliant. Thank you. We will catch up with you later.
Thank you.
And next, this is a good old roller coaster we've got going today. We have the amazing Mhara Starling for you, and I'm going to add to the screen and hopefully technology. Hello.
Hello.
It works. It works.
Oh,
welcome. So I drew the short straw pronouncing Welsh names, so my apologies to anyone if I don't pronounce them properly. But Branwen, you're going to be talking about, I believe. Fascinating. I don't know a lot about her, so I'm looking forward to this one. And of course, Mhara will be joining us at the end for the questions and answers as well. So again, if you've got any questions, pop them in the comments and we will bring them out at the end. I will leave the floor to you, Mhara, and learn something about Branwen. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And hello, everybody. Hello. It is absolutely lovely to be here. Thank you, Brett, for sharing information on Sabrina. And I'm very much looking forward to Jhenah and Kristoffer's presentations later on as well. But I'm here to talk about a goddess today that I've never actually spoken about publicly beyond in passing. So this is the first time that I'm properly doing something with this goddess, who is, of course, Branwen. So I've got my shared screen on now. Hopefully that has worked and Rachel can pop it up for you right now. If not, then we'll have to figure that out. But Branwen, the goddess that I refer to as the divine rarity, the chief ancestress and goddess of hope. So who exactly is this goddess and what can we say about her? So croeso, welcome. First and foremost, who am I? Well, if you've never come across me before, I guarantee it, you will come across me now. I'm a bit like a rash, so now that you've rubbed up against me once, you'll find me everywhere, as many people who already know of me can probably attest. by now. So if you haven't seen me online before, then you might have come across some of my strange videos, or you might come across my strange videos in the next few weeks, where I like to roll down hills and jump around forests talking about how pigs are actually creatures from the other world, are actually fairy creatures, which is not fake news, that's actually true, or how Welsh women love to curse people with their magical tatas, with their magical tits. So if you haven't come across those videos, you can find me pretty much everywhere. I'm like a venereal disease, so I'm everywhere. I'm on TikTok, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Instagram, I'm on pretty much everywhere. And I love to share the magic of my own culture, which is, of course, Wales. So I grew up on the Isle of Anglesey, up in the north of Wales, in a Welsh-speaking community. I went through schooling through the medium of the Welsh language, and I was privileged enough to have been given the opportunity to learn about the myths and lore of my culture throughout my entire childhood. So yes, that's me, Mhara Starling, Welsh witch. I write books, I do strange videos, but I'm also somebody who deeply loves and admires the stories, the legends, the lore, and the magic of my landscape. And of course, one of the people in that landscape is indeed Branwen. So Branwen is an interesting one to me because I have known Branwen for as long as I can remember. She is essentially a an old friend that I've known for literally forever. I remember some of my earliest memories of coming into contact with Welsh mythology and Welsh folklore in general came in the form of the ways in which I was introduced to these topics in school. So I remember quite vividly taking part in an art project where we created a mural depicting an image of Bendigeidfran, who is Branwen's brother. We'll talk about him a little more in a moment, crossing the Irish Sea. And Bendigeidfran is a giant, so it's quite a lovely image, the idea of him crossing the sea to go into battle. And that art project has kind of seared itself onto my memory. As well as this, at the same time, I was visiting various different theatres to watch theatrical renditions of the stories that are woven into the four branches of the Mabinogi. I can remember quite vividly going to watch a theatrical performance or interpretation of the fourth branch of the Mabinogi, which was beautiful, absolutely wonderful. But if you know anything about the fourth branch of the Mabinogi, then you will know that at the end of it, one of the characters, Blodeuwedd, is transformed into an owl. And at that moment, in the theatrical rendition of this performance, as she transformed into the owl, the actress suddenly broke out into a very moving rendition of Kelly Clarkson's Breakaway, which, if you know that song, you'll know it matches just perfectly with Blodeuwedd's journey. But similarly, I also went to a pantomime production of the second branch of the Mabinogi. The second branch of the Mabinogi being the story that we see Branwen featured within. And this pantomime was bonkers, absolutely bonkers. There was a giant cauldron on stage. Bendigeidfran was played by a very tall man who was also on stilts, so he was made even taller. Branwen's half-brother Evnishen was played by a guy who was essentially a leather-clad older daddy type, and I can't believe they got away with that in a pantomime production meant for children. And the narrator of the pantomime was a starling who told us the story along the way. So as you can probably imagine from all that, I have grown up associated with these stories and connected to these stories on a rather intimate level, being told the stories by my teachers, visiting theatrical productions and such throughout my upbringing, and it's a very privileged upbringing to have. And so the magic of Wales is something that I love to share and love to delve deep into. And today, of course, we're focusing predominantly on this figure, Branwen. So who exactly is Branwen? Well, Branwen, to give you a very brief introduction to her, is the daughter of a guy called Hir. So when you open up a copy of the Four Branches of the Mabinogi, which you can buy translations of online, my personal recommendation is to get the Sioned Davies version. Sioned Davies, which is published by Oxford. Now, in the contents page, the table of contents, you'll see that each individual story usually comes under a specific title. We've got Pwyll Pendefig Dyfed as the first story, And then the second story is Branwen Ferch Hir. Branwen, the daughter of Hir. Hir is her father, and he's a patriarch of one of the primary lineages that we follow in the four branches of the Mabinogi. And this lineage includes other characters that are quite important, such as Bran, or Bendigeidfran, and Manawydan, just to name two. Now, the story of Branwen is represented in this branch in particular. The main corpus of Welsh mythology is referred to as the four branches of the Mabinogi, which is quite a visceral image that you can place in front of you. You can imagine it as one great tree with numerous branches kind of going off on their own little quests, and it's rather a gorgeous visual, if you ask me. And of the four branches, the titles that we give the four branches, this story is the only one that is named after a woman, which is quite surprising considering if you read the Mabinogi, you'll know that women play an important role in all four of the branches and in the other stories that come under the collection that we refer to as the Mabinogion. The Mabinogion. So Branwen is one of the characters who features in this story. She is nobility, she is royalty. She takes place in this very strange part of Wales's history where we can tell that in the story the Romans are nearby, but they're not quite here yet. So the story is set in a pre-Christian past, in some kind of past that the people who would have told these stories had heard echoes of and had a memory of, sort of a folk memory, but that this is a time period before the coming of Christianity and before the full-on Roman occupation of Britain. And during this period, the king of all of Britain, the entirety of the island of Britain, is Bran the Blessed, who is a giant, and his sister is Branwen. Now, of course, beyond her role in the Mabinogi and in Welsh mythology, Branwen has become a very popular character both in Wales and beyond, and today she's even revered as a goddess by many. So let's explore aspects of Branwen's lore. And we need to start by looking at her name. Now, names in Welsh mythology can tell us quite a bit about characters. Usually a name isn't just a name, there's something going on there that can give us an insight into what kind of character, what kind of entity, what kind of person these beings are that we are following in these stories. So Branwen's name is fairly interesting because to most it seems pretty straightforward. The first part of her name, Bran, comes from Bran, meaning corvid or crow. So that's crows or birds within the family of Corvidae, which is, of course, the family that includes crows, ravens, those kinds of birds. So that part is fairly simple, and we know that her brother also has that part in his name as well. Bran, crow or raven. The second part of the name, however, is a little bit more complicated. Now, the way that Branwen's name is usually translated by most people is simply as the white crow, the white raven, or the white corvid. Just very, very simply straightforward. And that's because that final part of the name, when, comes from a word that essentially means the colour white. So she's often represented in art and such as being a white raven or a white crow for this reason. But when we translate her name from Branwen, the Welsh, into English as simply white crow or raven, we kind of miss a little bit of the nuance and complexity that goes into her name. So that when portion, though it does translate to mean the colour white, it can also be translated in a variety of other ways. So not only the colour white, as in the colour of a sheet of paper or the colour of snow, when can also be translated to mean fair or holy or blessed or possibly, and this is kind of stretching it a little bit, but possibly even divine. It's something that is kind of held up above all else, something that is special, something that is rare, something that is beautiful. And so when we look at it like that, her name can be translated in a few alternate different ways. So rather than just the white crow or the white raven, we can translate her to be the fair raven, the blessed crow, the blessed corvid or corvidae. And then on top of that, the term Branwen, meaning a white crow or a white corvid, is also used within a Welsh context to denote anything that is incredibly rare, something that is a rarity to behold. And so we could also translate her name to mean rarity, or perhaps the divine corvid or the divine rarity, the divine rare being. And she is very much attributed as being quite a rare creature. She's described as being one of the most beautiful women in all of existence, that her looks, her appearance, her fairness radiates with the sheer power and complexity of the sun and the moon. She is this glorious being who people cannot help but be fixated on with their eyes when they see her. Now, of course, she's part of a family referred to as the Children of Hir, and all of the Children of Hir have this kind of association with either corvids or the sea. These are the two primary things that we see them associated with. So the Children of Hir, the family lineage that Branwen belongs to, is a noble and powerful lineage within the four branches of the Mabinogi, alongside the Children of Dawn, or the Children of Belly as well. So these are the different family lines that we tend to follow within the four branches. And the Children of Hir are the ones who are focused on predominantly in the second branch and also the third branch. Now, Hir, who is he? Who exactly is he? The father of Branwen and the patriarch of this lineage that Branwen is part of. Well, fascinatingly, Hir, the name itself, as we've probably already guessed from looking at Branwen's name, we can learn a lot about a character by looking at their name. His name translates to mean sea or flow or currents. So Hirion was an old way that people used to say seas in Welsh, which is quite foreign to those of us who speak Welsh today, because we tend to say moroedd or mor, as in the sea in that context. But in older Welsh poems and such, we see poems refer to the sea as Hir and seas in its plural form as Hirion. So here we have an entity whose name literally means the sea. And his children have these associations with nobility, with royalty, with rulership, kingship, also with things like corvids and blessed or holiness. So if you look at your screen right now and you can see this PowerPoint in front of you, then you'll see a little bit of a family tree of all the different characters that are part of that lineage that Branwen finds herself within. There's Hir and his wife Penarddun, and they are the parents of Bran, or Bendigeidfran, the king of the Isle of the Mighty, aka Britain, his sister Branwen, who of course we're focusing on, and their brother Manawydan. Branwen later goes on to have a child called Gwern. But there's also a little kind of scoop over to the other side where Penarddun, in a previous marriage with a man called Eiroswydd, has two other children, Nishen and Evnishen, who play a role in the story of the second branch of the Mabinogi. And Nishen and Evnishen are kind of like a light half and a dark half of the same being almost. They seem to represent two opposing or polar opposite forces. Nishen is somebody who can bring peace. He's a true peace weaver, whereas Evnishen seems to cause nothing but crap everywhere he goes. So all of these characters, they play somewhat of a role in Branwen's story, and that gives you a little background to her family lineage, at least. Now, going back for a second to the meaning of Branwen's name, now that we've touched upon her family, her brother Bendigeidfran, when we look at his name, especially this epithet of his name, so his name is Bran, with a little torbach or little roof, as we call it. I think it's called a circumflex in English, above the A. That's his name, Bran, but he's also referred to under the epithet of Bran Vendigaid or Bendigeidfran. Bendigeidfran is an interesting name when we compare it to what we talked about a moment ago when looking at Branwen's name in particular. So as we already discussed, Branwen can be translated to mean white corvid, white crow, but it can also be translated to mean blessed crow, blessed corvid, fair corvid. And Bendigeidfran, that name, that epithet placed upon Bran, when we look at his name in that context, it means exactly the same thing. So these two names are essentially the same name. And this is something that was pointed out by a scholar called Patrick Ford in an essay he created called Branwen, the Celtic Affinities. And in that essay, he goes on to discuss that these two names share a similar etymological root. However, there's something interesting going on. Bendigeidfran's name, so Bran's name, when he has that epithet placed upon it of Bendigeid, comes from a Latin influence. So Bendigeid comes from Bendicet, so meaning blessed or holy, and it's placed upon that name with that Latin influence on the Welsh language. The Welsh language has a little bit of a Latin influence on it due to the Roman occupation of Britain, of course. So there are some things that we share with the other languages who have Latin influence as well. So here we see that Latin influence in Bendigeidfran, giving us the name blessed, holy, or fair crow or corvid. But if we look at Branwen rather than Bendigeidfran, this is the same name but with more of a native expression behind it. So Patrick Ford put forth the notion that perhaps Branwen is the original older native name and that Bendigeidfran is a later name that was placed upon the story. And he even goes on to propose some rather out there theories, which I'm not sure many scholars actually agree with nowadays, that perhaps, maybe, and this is pure speculation now, that Branwen and Bendigeidfran, once upon a time, were actually one and the same character. And that essentially, as the monks were scribing these stories in later periods, they couldn't handle the idea of a powerful, strong warrior goddess, and so they split the two characters into the beautiful, fair, but timid Branwen and the noble, giant king Bendigeidfran. Again, that's all just speculation, but I still find it fairly interesting to look at and to point out the notion that these names give us a little bit of an insight into what's going on here with Welsh culture. So, Branwen, Bendigeidfran, two names that mean exactly the same thing. One with Latin influence, meaning it's probably more recent, and one with no Latin influence, meaning it possibly is older. But once again, going to reiterate that that is pure speculation. But it is interesting when we consider the way in which Branwen is talked about in the story of the second branch of the Mabinogi. So one epithet that's instantly placed upon Branwen is that she is the chief matriarch, queen, or ancestress of the island of the mighty. She's one of three chief matriarchs, queens, or ancestresses. So within the text of the second branch of the Mabinogi, Branwen is referred to in relation to a triad. So if you've never heard of a triad, if you don't know what the trioedd or the triads are, let me give you a very, very brief overview. The triads are essentially a catalogue of ideas that are found in older Welsh tradition, and the triads are essentially expressed in triadic format, hence why we call them the triads. So usually when we look at the triads, it'll say something, a title of something, so it'll say the three chief magicians of the island of Britain, and then it'll list the three magicians that are the three primary magicians. And here we see Branwen being referred to within the context of a triad that we have ultimately lost. So within the text of the second branch of the Mabinogi, she is referred to as one of the tri prif rhiant, or tri prif rhiant of the island of Britain. And rhiant is a really interesting word that's being used here to denote what Branwen is. Rhiant is utilised sometimes in the modern Welsh language in the form of rhiant, to mean parent or something. But this word can also be translated to mean the matriarchs, the queens. So some people theorize that Rhian or Rhiant could also come from Rhian, meaning queen. So here we see her being referred to as a great queen, which if we were to go back for a moment to this idea that Branwen and Bendigeidfran are the same names, and that possibly if we speculate really far and we stretch our minds quite a bit and we determine that perhaps these characters were one and the same once upon a time, if we allow ourselves the opportunity to think of it in that way, we have a character who is called the divine, the holy, the blessed Corvid, crow, raven. And if we look at Branwen's epithet as this chief something, and we look at it specifically as chief queen, then we have a great queen associated with corvids. Does that remind you of another goddess within Celtic cosmology, perhaps relating to a goddess that is across the water from us over in Ireland? I'm not going to say their name, but I think you know who I'm talking about. Could it be that Branwen perhaps expresses a closeness with that entity? Again, speculation. But it is clear that Branwen is referred to as one of the chief matriarchs, queens, or ancestresses of Wales, which gives us an insight into just how important she is and why she was such a good match for the King of Ireland. And speaking of the King of Ireland, let's talk very briefly about Branwen's story. So I'm going to go through this as quickly as I possibly can, but it is a complicated story. Essentially, the second branch of the Mabinogi starts with a fleet of ships arriving at Harlech, where Bran the Blessed has his court. And he is, of course, the king of the island of the mighty, the king of all of Britain. He gets very agitated when this fleet arrives, thinking that perhaps something is wrong, when suddenly a group of Irishmen come to shore and they say, we want to create a connection between Wales and Ireland. And the way that we think we should do this is by marrying the king of Ireland, Matholwch, to Branwen, your sister. Can we have your permission for the marriage to take place? And after a little bit of consideration, Bran agrees to the union, thinking it's in their best interest. But during their wedding feast at Aberfraw, which is where I'm from, lovely, the story takes place where I'm from, one of Branwen's half brothers, Evnisian, who is known for being a bit of a doo-doo stirrer, shall we say, so I don't swear, he turns around and says that he's actually deeply offended that nobody asked his permission for his sister to get married. It was back in those days, when you could be angry because somebody married off your sister without asking you your opinion on the subject. And so, in retaliation, he does what any ordinary person does, and he decides to mutilate all of the Irish king's horses. Normal behaviour right there. The Irish king, of course, and the Irish people become enraged at this act. And if you know anything about Celtic culture, you'll know that horses usually represent the very sovereignty of a group of people. And so to mutilate their horses is essentially to question their sovereignty, to question their identity and their rulership. So eventually, Bran says, okay, we need to repay them and make this better. We need to create reparations for the offence that Evnisian has caused. And so he gifts an abundance of things, new horses, new shields, new weapons, all sorts of things to the Irish. But the Irish king turns around and says, that's not enough. We need more. And so Bran gifts them a magical cauldron. And this cauldron has the ability to bring dead warriors back to life, albeit a shell of their former selves. They cannot speak after they come out of the cauldron. And off they go over to Ireland, where they live their life. Branwen and Matholwch have children, have a child, I should say, and everything seems to be going well. Branwen is doing all she can to try and fit into her new culture, her new society. But after a few years, there are some grumbles in the kingdom, and they say to the Irish king, the kingdom people, the peasants, I suppose, say to the Irish king, that cauldron wasn't enough. We're still offended at what happened over in Wales. You need to, get better reparations for us. And the Irish king doesn't know what to do. And so, as punishment for the offence that the Welsh caused, he sends Branwen down to live in the kitchens where she is abused daily. And as she lives here, being abused, living in squalor, she ultimately makes friends with a little starling. And she trains little Starling in hopes that the Starling will fly over the sea carrying a message to her brother so that her brother can come and rescue her from her dire situation, which of course he does. He crosses the sea, and being a giant, he needs no ship. He just walks over the water, and he comes to Branwen's aid. And initially the Irish seem to go, oh, okay, we don't want to fight. We'll give you a gift as an apology for what we've done. But it was all a trick. So a great war breaks out, and this war ultimately ends in the death of many, many people, including Branwen's child, most of Ireland, and ultimately Branwen's brother. So Bran ends up being decapitated and his head lives on, and they return back to Wales. But after they return back to Wales, Branwen looks back at the scene over at Ireland and at her own landscape, and she thinks to herself, this is all my fault. She takes on the weight and the burden of everything that has happened. And there, at the shores of the River Allow, she lays down and she dies of a broken heart. So, quite an intense story, quite a sad story. Makes you wonder why this is the story that schools tend to focus on when it's so intense. And that was the abridged version. There's a lot more horrors that go on in this story than just that. I urge you to go find a copy and read it. So that brings us to this. Is Branwen a goddess? Because this is quite a big topic of debate. Could Branwen be perceived as a goddess? Because, of course, in the text of the Four Branches of the Mabinogi, she's never referred to as a goddess, and she dies at the end, implying that she is mortal, right? Well, this is a bit of a complicated topic. Deities in Welsh mythology in general are complicated topics because none of the characters in our myths are ever referred to as gods. And because most of these stories have a medieval kind of layering over them, a lot of people argue that they are nothing but medieval literature. But this ignores a couple of things. First and foremost, ignores the fact these stories quite clearly take place in a period of time prior to the coming of Christianity and prior to the Roman occupation of Britain, implying this is a pre-Christian period of time. On top of that, some of the names of the characters preserved in Welsh mythology share commonalities and cognates with older deities found across various Celtic regions. Some examples would be, Mabon, who is featured in the story of Culhwch Olwen, is very much closely cognate with Maponos, a god of the mainland of Europe at the time. But even if we ignore all that, we have to consider the process of apotheosis. By today, there are many, many people who turn to Branwen and relate to her story and revere her as a goddess. And so, by that process of apotheosis, it's only fair to say that, yes, she has become a goddess, regardless of whether she was a goddess in the past or not. So Branwen today inspires people, continually inspires people in Wales and beyond. So her story still rings true to us. In Wales, we see artistic interpretations of her constantly pop up, and in pagan culture, we see her revered as a goddess across the world, and her story continues to inspire writers in the fantasy fiction genre. And one thing I'm going to finish on as we come to the close of this talk is the starling itself, a symbol rightfully associated with Branwen as she friended the little starling and sent it over the sea. A small, beautiful bird who she hoped would make it across the waters and get her brother. Now, some folklore has built up around the starling and its connection to Branwen. On the picture on the screen in front of me right now, you can see a Bronze Age monument, which has become known on Anglesey as Bedd Branwen, the grave of Branwen. This is where she supposedly died, but of course this is a Bronze Age monument, so it's probably not as connected, but it has become connected within folk tradition. And I remember growing up with stories, because in this area, starlings love to murmurate, and I was constantly told that the starlings gather in this area in particular because they mourn Branwen, they mourn their goddess. And I just love that. I absolutely adore that. So when we look at Branwen in particular, I see her as a goddess of a variety of things. I see her as a goddess of hope. She who, amidst all the traumas and trials and tribulations she faced, placed all of her hope in a tiny little bird that she hoped would make its way across the sea. She never gave up that hope, not until the very end when the devastation came to it all. So a goddess of hope. She carries the weight of the world on her shoulders and blames herself for many things, which is a concept and an idea that many of us can relate to. I also see her as a patron of foreigners in strange lands, as a patron of those who see themselves on the margins, see themselves pushed to the very boundaries of existence, those of us who are often turned into the scapegoats for situations. And so I turn to her for a variety of reasons in that respect. And of course, a goddess of sovereignty. Everything went tits up in this story when Bran decided to marry her off and send her away from her home over to a strange land where she was not respected by the people. So thank you for joining me on this brief little introduction to Branwen. If you enjoyed this story, if you enjoyed this presentation and you want to learn more about Branwen, the Four Branches, Welsh mythology, then my new book, Pagan Portals, A Mabinogi, releases in June of 2025. That's literally in about a month. So soon, very, very soon. And it is my birthday at the end of this month. So give me a birthday treat. pre-order my book, buy my book, give me a little treat for my birthday. My other 2 books are already available, and thank you so much for joining me. Diolch o galon, and thank you to Moon Books for inviting me to come onto MoonCon 2025. So I'll pass it back now over to Rachel.
Thank you. I love the names, the etymology of the names, and how much that shows information, and we can learn from it. I think that's fascinating. That's how we work with it. Brilliant. Thank you so much. If anyone has any questions for Mhara or on Branwen, pop it in the comments and we will put it to the panel in a short while. We'll let Mhara go and have a lie down and we will catch you in a while. Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you.
This is like speed dating with Welsh goddesses, isn't it? It's all a bit of a roller coaster. Next, we have the amazing Jhenah Telyndru, and she is going to be talking to us about Rhiannon. So let's welcome. There you go. It works. Hello.
Hello. So glad to be here. Thank you, everyone. What a wonder.
Brilliant. Lovely to see you again. Looking forward to hearing about Rhiannon. I will let you go because my Welsh is terrible. And I'm actually quite embarrassed to be saying the words because it's such a beautiful language when it's spoken properly. So I'm going to hand it over to you and have fun with it.
Thank you. Thank you all. So glad to be with you here today. Love to be in such amazing company. Obviously, you can tell from off the bat that I am not Welsh, so I'm coming from outside of the culture, but I have been in devotional relationship with many Welsh goddesses for more than 35 years. I have a master's degree in Celtic Studies from the University of Wales, Trinity St. David. I am an ongoing Welsh learner, and so I'll do my best to pronounce the names as well as I can, but really quite honored to be here today to speak with you about the goddess Rhiannon. And I thought we'd begin with a little prayer that I wrote to her a few years ago. Perhaps we can close our eyes and find our breath and just spend a moment hearing about her, connecting with her. And through this, I think you'll learn some about some of her attributes. And we need her energy now in the world, I believe. So, Lady Rhiannon, Holy Sovereign, Great Queen of the other world, teach us the way of the white horse, that we may journey on the paths of this world with clarity of purpose and strength of heart, holding fast to the sacred center of our inner truth, even in the face of all hardships and injustices. Teach us the way of the 3 birds, that we may find courage in times of darkness and relief from our burdens and cares, that the parts of ourselves we have thought long dead may arise in joy and gladness once more. Teach us the way of the Divine Mother, that we may nurture truth, birth understanding, and act with endless compassion for ourselves and others. Show us the ways of unconditional love and loyalty, that we may know when to hold tight and when we must let go. Teach us the way of the Great Queen, that we may walk in this world in our power, in unflinching pursuit of our true purpose, and unafraid to ask for that which we need as we come fully into the light of our sovereignty. Lady Rhiannon, Holy Sovereign, Great Queen of the other world, teach us to be free. So thank you for letting me share that. 3 breaths into presence. And I do have a shared screen. Is that up? I can't tell. Okay, here we are. Very good. Thank you for that. So let's talk about Rhiannon. It is very difficult to condense this all into a 30-minute process, but I'm going to do my best. Ooh, there's a weird kind of sound in the background. I think that's Rachel, if you could mute yourself, perhaps. Thank you. So there is the the little prayer that if you want to screenshot that so you have it for yourself, I'm happy for you to do so. But let's talk about sources and cultural context, because I think this is very important, especially for people who are coming to this work from outside of Welsh culture. I know for myself that it has been a process of learning, of trying to participate in culture through my studies, through language learning, through being in the landscape. And there's some particular things that we have to know when we are approaching Welsh divinities, particular that we don't have in other cultures, which is that these stories were not written down until the medieval period. And so they dwelt, we believe, in orality for a good 800 or so years between the end of the pre-Christian period, so when Wales was actively non-Christian, devoted to their variety of divinities, and the stories being written down. So in that time that they dwelt in orality, they changed and evolved over time as oral tales do. But they started to get written down in the vernacular, meaning in Welsh language itself, during a time of a lot of cultural change in Wales when they had lost their independence to England. And so there was a sense of urgency to preserve culture. And so it appears that, and the scholar Sianed Davies writes about this, that the stories of the four branches, which is where we see the majority of the references to Rhiannon in these early periods, appear to have been transcribed from orality directly. There are phrases in the stories that point to them having been recited. And so there is a sense then that the stories as we have them are a reflection, as all stories are going to be, of the needs and the wants and the culture of the people in the time that the stories are being told. And so there are many layers of tale that have been woven together, much like a Celtic knotwork. And so there is a very clear veneer and stream that is of the contemporary medieval audience. And so that's why we have these princely courts and things that are very much rooted in the medieval period. But there are also strands that are clearly older, that perhaps likely, but in academia, we always have to couch things in those languages, the language of perhaps, because we can't ever know. Clearly, from the pre-Christian period. And so we have the sense that a lot of these figures, although they're never directly identified as divinities in any of these early vernacular tales, because why would they be? This is a very Christian culture. But we can suss out their older forms of them, original forms perhaps. But I want to be clear that there are two things that I think is important. That there's a sense that perhaps the Christian church, that there were these monks in cells writing these stories down and manipulated the tales to make the figures in them who were divinities less palatable, perhaps, to worship. And perhaps that happened in other places and in other genres, but not in the four branches, not in with these manuscripts that a lot of these tales come from, not just the four branches, but the other native tales and a lot of early poetry. These appear to be the result of a natural, organic shift of tale over time. And so the stories are not broken in the forms that they are, but we do need to engage in this mythic archaeology to kind of pull out these strands that hearken from the older age. To understand, though, that the stories were important to people at the time, that Rhiannon, as we're going to talk about, where the kinds of deity that she may once have been, we will not have any shrines to her or dedicatory, temples and things like that, because the Celts didn't do that. They didn't write their things down. They did not build temples generally out of stone or out of materials that remained, but we do know that there is this sense of a pantheon of divinities, and Rhiannon is among them. But the stories, again, are not broken in the forms that we have them. We do have to do a little more, as I said, mythic archaeology to get there, but do know that they were relevant to the culture at the time, and they are relevant to the culture today, which is why I think it's important, especially as a person who comes from outside of the culture, and those of you who are interested or are engaged in devotional relationships with these divinities, to recognize that you are coming into relationship with divinities that have an associated living culture. So I think it's very important for us to understand cultural context, both of the medieval period, to be able to look back to where these deities may have come from, but also to recognize that there are living Welsh people for whom this is an important part, even if they are not in devotional worship with these divinities. It's very much part of their culture and a source of cultural pride. And so I think that it's important for us to go into that with that information. So let's talk a bit about what we know about her. One of the things that we see, mythologists and folklorists who are trained to look at stories that have been in oral tradition, there are a couple of mythic mechanisms that come into play as stories change and as stories evolve. And one of those is something called reverse euhemerism, which means that figures who were once divinities tend over time to kind of devolve into something less than divinity, but still have aspects that support that they had once been divinities. And in Welsh tradition, what we tend to see are figures who have associations with the other world, who have magical qualities like fairy queens or giants like Bran, or who are magicians or sorcerers and having dealings with the other world. And we do see this very much clearly with Rhiannon. In fact, immediately upon her entry into the story in the first branch, we see her riding a white horse, something that would have pinged her immediately as having otherworldly associations, and in fact sovereignty associations, which we'll talk about shortly. She emerges near to or out of a Gorsedd, a wondrous hill, a place of gathering associated with magic and the other world. She rides a horse that no matter how quickly it is pursued, it always magically is further away. So the other world is known in Welsh tradition to have its own sense of the laws of physics and time and space. And so it's clearly an otherworldly figure dressed in gold brocade, which is a symbol throughout the four branches of the Mabinogi for people who are of the other world. In fact, when she winds up marrying Pwyll, who is her choice for a husband, they get married in her father's court, and that is also in the other world. She has a bag that I call it Rhiannon's bag of holding. It cannot be filled, no matter how much is placed within it, except for a very specific circumstance, the feet of a nobleman in it, saying it is full. So she possesses these qualities and these objects that are firmly associate her with the other world, and perhaps most famously are the Adar Rhiannon, the birds of Rhiannon, who possess the power to lull the living into serenity and peace and to wake the souls of the dead. And it is heard, they appear in the second branch of the Mabinogi, also in Colwyn, with these powers. And in the second branch, it is stated that although it sounds like the birds are singing in the room with the gathered company, they are actually across the ocean in the other world. So they have that kind of bilocational ability. Wibbly wobbly, timey, spacey stuff. So very much connected with the other world. Again, even though she's not stated directly as being a divinity, but we have other tools that we can use to look at that. And that is the etymology of her name. She has this O-N ending, I-O-N, I-O-N-A, we see in a lot of Celtic deities, particularly from Wales, and also some of the Gaulish divinities show this as well, which means divine, that this is a divine queen. Rhiannon potentially means queen. So right from her name, it could also mean perhaps associated with the Welsh word for parent, so divine parent. So in her name, it is clearly stated that she is of divinity. And when linguists do their linguistic magic, they can trace her name back to this common Celtic name Regantona, which is also has a common origin, is the common origin for the name of the Morrigan in Irish, whose name means great queen. So there is that association. There are reflex deities. So cognate deities are deities that names come from the same root. Reflex deities are deities that don't have the same name, but are from similar or adjacent cultures, and have similar functions. And so we have Epona from Gaul, Macha, who is one of the three often goddesses that make up the Morrigan. From Ireland, Matrona, the Divine Mother, the Matres, and Modron. So the first two there are from Gaul, and Modron from Wales. We'll talk about why those are reflex divinities to Rhiannon in a moment. But yes, I have to go quickly here. But the big connection between these two, Rhiannon and the Morrigan, they have etymologically cognate names. They're both sovereignty figures. And that's the big piece that I want to talk about, especially today. They have their association with otherworldly birds. They are psychopomps, the birds of the Morrigan, the crows, the corvids. They go to the battlefield to collect the souls of the dead warriors who died well in battle. And of course, their connections with the horse. I'm sorry, with the horse, of course. So let's talk about horses really quickly, 2 seconds. Horses in Celtic culture have associations with threshold magic. They are often put in, we found skulls in the archaeological record, in the thresholds into houses. They're considered liminal because they are both a status and a working animal. So the knights and the warriors would be on their horses, but we'd also use them in the fields, right? The apotropaic magic, so is that warding of misfortune. That's where the skulls in the threshold comes from. Psychopomps are those that convey spirits from one place to another, usually after dead, over thresholds between life and death, but also sometimes thresholds between this world and the other world. And of course, symbols of sovereignty, especially when they are white horses, and they have connections to king-making rights, not just in Wales and in Ireland and some other Celtic cultures, but also in other cultures of Indo-European derivation. So let's talk about Rhiannon as a goddess of sovereignty for a moment. She has, I'm sorry, suddenly I'm hearing, oh, okay, I don't know. That's very strange. I'll continue, but I do hear an echo. So, briefly, let's talk about what sovereignty figures are. Sovereignty figures are embodiments of the land. They are spirits of place, often goddesses who are protective. They are often river divinities. They can be divinities of particular regions and territories. And their role in early mythos is to test potential kingly candidates and confer sovereignty upon them through an act of sexual congress, the great marriage, if you will, and the king is invested with the right to rule through the sovereignty figure, but that right to rule comes from the other world. So it's the otherworldly connection of that particular place, that particular land, and sovereignty figures also have the ability to take that right to rule back if the king is unrighteous or if the king becomes ill or maimed in some way, because this union with the land through the sovereignty figure ties the fate of the land with the fate of the king. So it is a very important process. Now, we know, for example, that during the medieval period, this is not how kingship was conferred, although there is a particular story that Gerald of Wales relates about an Irish king who mates with a white horse, and then it is slaughtered and turned into a soup, and then he and his court drink of this soup while he is bathed in it. Perhaps an older tale, perhaps a little slam against the Irish. Gerald of Wales apparently had some issues, but there are similar rites that we know of from India. So there are connections, and we feel like this is one of those layers of tale that are older in form. They are pre-Christian, and it is why in Irish tradition we have figures. In Irish tradition, tales were written down earlier than those in Wales. We have figures who say, "I am the sovereignty." It is really clear that they are conscious of that, but it's a little more subtextual in the Welsh stories, and sometimes becomes symbolic, like the seeking of the cauldron, of by Arthur in The Spoils of Annwn, and that later informs the Grail mythos. But there is a transformation often involved when the king is being tested. Often the tester, the sovereignty figure, is in the form of a hag, and when the sexual congress occurs and the land now has a new king, the land is renewed, and so is the figure of sovereignty. She becomes a beautiful woman. But that's not the only transformation that occurs. What we see with Rhiannon, there are certain incidents in her tales where she is not in accord with the man that she has as husband, and there are 2, potentially 3 husbands that we see in her tale, and in those places that she takes on her most equine qualities when she is not in right relationship, or he is not in right relationship with her, such as Pwy, who punishes her for the supposed murder of their child, and says that she must sit for 7 years outside of their court, tell everyone about her heinous deed, and bear them on her back to the presence of the court. So in that case, she is assumed to be, again, strong enough to carry people on her back, but also that she takes on this horse-like quality. She reverts to her more otherworldly state, which is as a figure of sovereignty. She marries several times. She marries Pwy in the first branch. She marries Manawydan in the second. Manawydan as the one of the brothers of Branwen, as Mhara mentioned earlier. And then there is a third man who appears to have been potentially, perhaps it was a separate story stream about her, and then those stories became interwoven. But Tiernan, who I believe Brett mentioned, his etymology is divine lord of the thundering waters, and it is almost equivalent to Rigantona, this tier Taigernos in the common Celtic. And he appears, he is the man whose white horse gives birth to a beautiful foal every year on May Eve. And this one year he stops that foal from being taken, as it has been in all previous years, by a monster. And as he pursues the monster and then returns to his home, he finds Rhiannon's newborn baby taken from her, and for which she was punished, and raises the child until he realizes who his parents probably are and returns this child to them. And I'll mention that briefly. Oh, there's not a lot of time. But one of the things I love so much about Welsh mythos is that it is very solidly rooted in the landscape. This is an amazing map of the landscape of myth in Wales, and it places Rhiannon's story here and Dyfed, and this is the region that appears to be connected with her. So although the story does not make this clear, things are a little bit reversed. She marries a man who is already the Prince of Dyfed, and then when Pwy dies, and then she winds up in courtship with Manawydan, her son Pryderi gives these 7 cantrefs of Dyfed to them. So she has an association specifically with this place in mythos, and potentially in the older version of the story, these princes, would have received this the ability to be sovereign over these places through her. You can go and visit some of the places mentioned in the first branch. This is Castle Arberth, which is, these are older, more recent ruins. I believe they are Norman, but there are always layers of habitation in certain places. So it's likely that there are older layers beneath these ruins here. And then here is potentially the Gorsedd of Bards, that wondrous hill where Rhiannon is first espied by Pwy, where he was told that a noble being on that hill would either be assailed by many blows or be visited by a wonder, and that wonder was Rhiannon. So places that you can visit, places in the landscape connected to her. Oh, I have not much time, but I want to mention this other very powerful aspect of Rhiannon that connects her to another lineage of goddesses, that she is the divine mother, and her son is the exalted prisoner, the divine son. She has connections with the with Modron, who is connected to Matrona, who is a Gallo-Roman divine mother. So there's worship of the divine mother, and then these triple mothers on the continent, the Matronae or the Matres. But the story that we know of Matrona is that she has a son whose name is Maponus, and his cognate deity is Mabon. So it's Modron, and then her son Mabon ap Modron, so the divine son, son of the divine mother. So there's this whole lineage of divine mothers that has a connection to Rhiannon. I'm not saying that they are one and the same, but that she is part of that complex of goddesses. And why is that? Because Modron has her son also stolen from her. Very much like, and this is the information about Mabon, much like Rhiannon has stolen from her, and then it isn't until in Culhwch and Olwen that Mabon is restored, that he is found where he was been imprisoned in the other world. Pryderi, similarly, who is Rhiannon's son, was imprisoned in the other world in the third branch, and it is Rhiannon who goes to bring him back. And what's special about Pryderi is that Pryderi is the only figure who appears in all four branches of the Mabinogi. And what's significant about that is the Mabinogi, we believe that the title of these stories means Tales of the Divine Child, Mabon Ogi, and perhaps then Pryderi as a reflex of Mabon. There may be a whole story cycle about Mabon and Pryderi, or Mabon as Pryderi, or Pryderi in the form of Mabon. It is, again, very twisted kind of knot work that connects the two figures together. So, but this is Rhiannon's son, and that connection with Modron is important one, I think. That and we have, just to put it in a timeline of context, we have material culture around in Rheged, which is in the Old North, in north of Wales, in the Scotland area by Hadrian's Wall. We have material culture showing the worship of Mabon, the worship of Modron in that area in the 1st century CE. And then these stories are written down in Wales in the 12th 13th century CE. So there's a lot of space in between there, and a lot of time for these stories to evolve, to spread, and perhaps to inspire. So I think it's important for us as modern practitioners, if you wish to be in relationship with any of these divinities that we're talking about today, that ways to build bridges to these divinities. And this is especially important for those of us who are outside of the culture, because I believe that culture of origin in any tradition, but we're speaking about this one now, is a key to understand how these divinities are a reflection of the land, how people and culture are also reflections of the land. So what needs are they meeting of the people? This is an image of Epona. It is of Celtic design, but it is from the Roman period. She is holding a torque showing her sovereignty. And so there is a lot about this that speaks to that lineage that Rhiannon is associated with. I think that like calls to like. Intention draws attention. So creating a shrine of connection, in investing yourself in things that are connected to Rhiannon, horse rescues, donating time, energy, money to children's missing children's organizations as a devotional act, studying the mythos, studying the language, studying the culture, being able to go visit in the landscape. I think these are really important ways to come into connection with these deities. Just a couple of other pieces here. I've already said this. And I would like to just share one last thing, the Rhiannon transposture. This comes from my book on Rhiannon from Moon Books. I'm going to show you that here in a second. But if you want to grab that QR code or that tiny URL so that you have this packet that you can use to engage and try to connect with Rhiannon, I invite you to do so. And then there's just more about me and my books, and my newest one from Moon Books is not on here. So let me stop sharing this so that I can show you. So I'm very honored to be part of this lovely hardcover special edition. And this just came out last month, I believe, or April. And it has both Rhiannon and my other book with Moon Books, which is about Blodeuwedd. So 2 for 1. It's cheaper to buy this beautiful hardcover than it is to buy both of those books together. Oh my goodness, somehow I did it in a half hour. I apologize for going so quickly. There's so much to discuss, but I hope that this little taster gives you a sense of the importance of understanding cultural context, of needing to kind of separate out some of the strands that are of the more contemporary medieval audience, to be able to look back to find the ones that are of more ancient origin, and that that reading these stories from those perspectives really helps you to understand who we're really dealing with, who we're really connecting with, and gives us ways of building bridges of connection by using symbolism and understanding. And just from a personal place, one of the things that I love so much about Rhiannon, and one of the ways that I relate with her most, is that she is someone who is unjustly accused. She has unconditional love and loyalty to her child, to her people. And she has always been there for me when I've been in places of pain and places of where I am in need of connection. And that is her first lesson to us at the beginning of her story. She rides out from the other world. She's pursued 3 times by the men of, and then Pwy himself. And finally, he calls out to her and he says, "Lady, in the name of he who you love the most, please stop." And immediately she pulls up her horse and she says, "It would have been better for your horse had you asked sooner." But what that says to me is that if we need Rhiannon, instead of pursuing her in all of these different ways, stop, center, and ask for her presence. She will stop. She will come to you, and she will be a beautiful source of support, whatever it is, whatever hardship that you are facing. Because I think the Welsh divinities, because they were written down when they were, they are very human in many ways. Their struggles and the the conflicts in their tales are relatable. They're not of a mythic proportion. They are ones that we individually can understand, and that we go through. And I think that makes them very approachable in that way. And because they understand the things that we are going through. So thank you for your time. I apologize for going a little over, but please do ask any of your questions. I know we're going to answer them later. And Rachel, thank you so much. And,
thank you. Beautiful prayer at the beginning. Thank you so much for that. And yes, any questions, pop them in the comments and we will throw them at the panel at the end. Thank you so much. And we will see you in a bit.
Fantastic. Yes, see you soon.
I don't really need to do any introduction for our next speaker. Let's just call him a legend, shall we? Hello.
Hello.
Kristoffer Hughes, ladies and gentlemen, Kristoffer Hughes. Now, another interesting goddess for us. Another one for me to pronounce, Arianrhod.
Pretty good. Well done.
Good? I've been practicing all day. I will come off the screen and let you do your thing and catch you for the questions afterwards. Have fun with it.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel, for that marvellous introduction. Hello, everybody. My name's Kristoffer Hughes. I'm the chief of the Anglesey Druid Order and an author of several books and the designer of tarot decks, 3 tarot decks in total. But this evening, I'm going to be talking to you about Arianrhod, perhaps one of the most enigmatic, misunderstood, perhaps the most mysterious of all of the goddesses within the Welsh pantheon. Now, whilst the majority of people in contemporary Western paganism will have come across and encountered Arianrhod in their journeys through Welsh mythology in particular, there's very little information that is correct, or perhaps there is information out there that have reached incorrect conclusions over the years when approaching Arianrhod herself. So my task in the next 30 minutes is to introduce you to who Arianrhod is from a cultural perspective, where she comes from, who she is, and what role she might have and might play within the lives and spiritual expression of contemporary Western pagans. So the first question that we need to ask when exploring any connection or any relationship with Arianrhod is, where does she come from? Well, we consider Arianrhod within Welsh culture to be a figure, a deity, we might argue, in contemporary Western paganism, but a spirit, an archetype, a construct that embodies and exemplifies the qualities of fate, fortune, and destiny. Now, there are various sources available to us in exploring who Arianrhod is, and they're surprisingly many. To the majority of people, I would imagine to the majority of you who are watching this video right now, that the primary source of information regarding Arianrhod will come from the four branches of the Mabinogi, predominantly the fourth branch itself. Now, the Mabinogi, the collection known as the Four Branches, comes to us from two primary sources. The first one is called Llyfr Gwyn Rhydderch, or the White Book of Rhydderch, compiled in the 1300s, and also Llyfr Coch Hergest, or the Red Book of Hergest. And within those two manuscripts, we see the majority of the tales that went to evolve and develop into the collection known as the Mabinogion, which contains, of course, the four branches. But Arianrhod also appears in numerous other sources within Welsh culture, one of those being Trioedd Ynys Prydain, or the triads of the islands of Britain, which is a collection of bardic triads that were easy to memorize because all of these triads run in fairly strict, metered, poetic language. Now, to people outside of Wales, so many of the materials pertinent to Arianrhod are locked into culture. So whilst there are English translations of Trioedd Ynys Prydain available, you can actually buy a book called The Triads of the Islands of Britain, edited by the late Celtic academic and scholar Rachel Bromwich. The majority of other materials pertinent to Welsh myth have not necessarily been translated into English. Now, one other source for Arianrhod comes from Llyfr Taliesin, or the Book of Taliesin. Now, you might be familiar with that one of old, because that one makes reference predominantly to another favourite goddess within Western paganism, who is Ceridwen. Penyath manuscript 131 mentions Arianrhod, so does the Llansteffan manuscript number 28. Astoria Taliesin, which is another corpus and body of work which also refers to Ceridwen as well as Arianrhod, and another one within that same corpus called Hanes Taliesin, or Penyath manuscript 111. So there are so many sources available to us. Now, the peculiar thing when it comes to Welsh mythology is that to the world outside of Wales, it is assumed that only that which is available within the English language actually exists. But there is so much more available to us. However, it's been locked into culture. It's been locked into place by the chains that bind language to itself. So as Welsh people, as Welsh speakers, as a native Welsh person myself, we are able to access material that isn't widely available to the rest of the world. And some of that I've been very, very fortunate to explore and express in my new book that will be coming out in July, called Arianrhod, Goddess of Fate, Fortune and Destiny, from Moon Books and Pagan Portal. So look out for that one coming out in July. And in that book, I go into much detail about so much information that has so far not been actively available to a non-Welsh speaking audience. But let's look primarily at the myths that surround and encompass and embody the figure of Arianrhod. The primary one is the fourth branch of the Mabinogi. And it's a particularly magically infused body of myth, and it's fairly different from the other three branches of the Mabinogi. There is so much more magic and numinous and ethereal qualities to the fourth branch than in the first three. And essentially, in a nutshell, it tells us about Gwydion and his twin brother Gilfaethwy, who lust over the foot holder of the High King and Druid Math of Gwynedd. So they feign a war. That's the only time that Math can be separated from his foot holder. His feet must be in the lap of a maiden. And he goes to war. And during that time, Goewin, the foot holder, is defiled by the brothers Gwydion and Gilfaethwy, who are subsequently punished for 3 years in the guise of different animals. When they return after their punishment, Math needs another foot holder. So Gwydion's sister, Math's niece, he calls her to the court and asks if she is indeed a maiden. She says, "I have no reason to believe that I am not." She steps over his wand and immediately gives birth to a small child and another thing. Now, Gwydion raises that other thing that eventually raises to become a young man, and then petitions Arianrhod, who has the duty to name that child, to give him arms, and to give him a consort. She refuses, of course. And all manners of shenanigans pursue in the making of a flower maiden, Blodeuedd, who is ultimately punished for trying to kill Lleu Llawgyffes, that Gwydion has managed to trick Arianrhod in giving him that name. And she is then transformed into an owl as punishment for what she did to Lleu. And there's an awful lot of ambiguity, twists and turns that happens in the fourth branch. And yet at the center of it is this figure of Arianrhod. And she behaves in a manner that would have been incredibly alien to a medieval Welsh audience. She acts in a way that is very unwomanly. We see this profound and magical gender ambiguity that occurs in the fourth branch, where Arianrhod behaves in a way that is counter femininity and womanhood in medieval customs and medieval Wales, and Gwydion himself is acting in a way that is very unmanly or against the status quo of what would have been considered masculine to a medieval Welsh audience. But at the heart of it is this figure, Arianrhod. She lives out on a fort, out at sea, separated from the rest of the family of Dawn. All the others seem to be all cozy and a close-knit community in the kingdom of Gwynedd, but Arianrhod is separate from them. After this shaming that happens to her in the court of Math, she retreats to her fort. And her fort is remarkable for a particularly powerful reason, in that her fort is very much still a part of the landscape of Wales. And the remarkable thing about living in Wales and being immersed in this culture is that we literally fall over evidence of these myths within the landscape itself. It is as if the landscape itself, the very soil, the very fabric of our earth, has offered us these stories for us to interpret. And talking about landscapes, the actual fort of Arianrhod, mentioned within myth in the fourth branch of the Mabinogi, is an actual physical place that exists to this day called Caer Arianrhod or Caer Aranrhod. And you can go and see it. It's just off the coast of the town of Carnarvon, and it only appears twice a day at very low tide. And from a vantage point of an ancient Celtic fort, which again, interestingly, is called Dinas Din Lleu, or the fort of the city of Lleu, who is, of course, the child that she dropped in the court of Math and was raised by Gwydion. And this city of Lleu overlooks Caer Arianrhod. So at low tide, you can still see some of the structures of that small island. The water levels have changed quite dramatically over the years, but we can still see it. It is still there as a part of the foundation, not only of our mythologies, but also as a vital component and aspect of our landscape, which I find remarkable, that just to look out of my window, from my bedroom window, I can see the very area where Caer Arianrhod lies. And that always fills me with a sense of belonging to these myths, but that the myths also belong to me. They belong to this landscape. They belong to us, the people. And I want to make an interesting note simply on that functionality of mythology in itself, that we are taking inspiration within modern paganism. We are gleaning inspiration from mythology. We are, by processes of apotheosis, transforming these ancient characters from ancient myths into deities and beings that can genuinely assist, help, and create quality, deep relationships with the adept, with the practitioner, and with the deity. And that's a remarkable thing. But of course, that's something that is relatively new. There's no evidence at all to suggest that Arianrhod or any of the people that populate the Mabinogi were revered as deities in the past. But we can also remark that the people of medieval Wales who lived in a Christian culture could not conceptualize that which they had no concept of, and they didn't have a concept of a goddess or another god that existed outside of that Christianized framework. And yet they're there, and they have developed into something that the modern world needs. And that's the beauty of myth, in that a myth is something that never happened. It never happened. Didn't happen to anyone at any time. But a myth is something that happens all the time. A myth is, in fact, an untruth that reveals an emergent truth. It reveals truths to the people who connect with myth in any particular time, in any sort of social or communal circle. The purpose of a myth is to extrapolate meaning and story from the landscape itself and have that meaning transform the internal constitution of society and of the individuals that live within it. So when we consider that myths, like the fourth branch of the Mabinogi, are ancient, that they are things from the past, that they are relics from the past, that isn't how we perceive mythology within a Welsh cultural context at all. Whilst, yes, they have an ancient component to them, but myths are also timeless. They're not locked into time. And perhaps a double-edged sword, I think. One of the worst things that could have ever happened to the myths is that they were written down. Prior to that, they only existed here on the shrines and the altars of the lips. But as soon as we wrote them down, we locked them into a logocentric location, into a place that seemingly is immovable. But that isn't how we, as Welsh people, see these myths. We see them as very much alive, as vibrant, and that they have the capacity to share with us messages that are pertinent to any single given age. So they are simultaneously ancient and timeless, and so is Arianrhod. And myths have been utilized by the folk, by the people. They are the property of the people, if you like, in connection and communion with the very song of the earth itself. But recently they've become commodities. They've become commodities of academia. They've become commodities of researchers who may, erroneously, in my opinion, claim ownership of them. But they don't gatekeep them, or they have no right to gatekeep them. For the myths belong to the people. They belong to the folk. And it means that that timeless element within myth means that we can extrapolate meaning and value from them in a way that is pertinent and conducive to profound and deep spiritual connection within modernity. So that was a little bit on myth. So let's go back to Arianrhod. And there's a peculiar sequence of events that happens within the fourth branch of the Mabinogi. Goewin, who means the brave or the bold, is in fact, one could say she's an embodiment of the very sovereignty of the land itself. And Math, as High King, as High Magician, as High Druid, is betrothed to the land itself. But Gwydion and Gilfaethwy, and this is a fairly triggering subject to talk about, Gwydion and Gilfaethwy defile Goewin. She is defiled by these two brothers. But it's also important to consider that these myths are not populated by people. These myths are populated by archetypal forces. And within this case, Goewin is representing the sovereignty of the earth itself. And the High King must be in a matrimonious, symbiotic relationship with the land. And it's only during aspects or elements of war that he's able to honourably be separated from that. But on his return, he finds that the brothers, Gwydion and Gilfaethwy, have defiled Goewin. The sovereignty is less because of their actions. So they're punished, and Arianrhod is brought onto the scene. Now, there's always been a question of paternity. Who is the father of these two children that Arianrhod births in the court of Math? And usually, particularly within Western paganism, the answer to that is that it must be Gwydion, her brother, by processes of incest. But Gwydion has been in an animal shape and form for 3 whole years. And Math already knows the name that he is going to give to one of these children. How does he know the name? He bends his wand in a particularly phallic fashion for Arianrhod to step over. And one way of looking at this peculiar relationship between Goewin and Arianrhod is that they are both the same figure occupying a different strata within the myth. They both represent elements of sovereignty within the land, but Arianrhod is there to correct what has happened because of the actions of Gwydion and Gilfaethwy. And this falls into a thing that I personally call the Gilfaethwy complex. The evil acts, the selfish acts that Gwydion and Gilfaethwy did in order to fulfill their desires and lust. And when we consider those actions and then how Arianrhod responded to those actions, we can extrapolate surprising meaning from those episodes. And if we try and make sense of the actions of Gilfaethwy in the fourth branch as the primary antagonist, what value and what meaning can we glean from that? So not only does the fourth branch offer profound insights into the consequences of unchecked desires and the disruption of the natural order, which is essentially what's happening in the fourth branch, and Arianrhod is stepping in to bring order back to that which has been disordered. But his actions, Gilfaethwy's actions, are driven entirely by personal lust, by desire. They symbolize a deeper existential crisis within humanity in itself, a shift from something that was communal, something that was harmonious, something that existed in symbiosis with the earth is suddenly fragmented, and a self-centered way of being is expressed. And this transformation reflects this danger that we face today in the 21st century, the dangers of hyper-individuation, where the focus of personal gratification supersedes the collective good, leading to a breakdown of relationships between humanity and the land itself. And in this myth, Gwydion, along with his brother Gilfaethwy, brings about a series of tragic events, and most notably this defilement of Goewin, the sovereignty of the land, the purity, that divine feminine principle of the land, and the sacred connection between land and people. And that violation symbolizes the severance of the bond between humanity and the earth, as the sacred relationship is corrupted by personal greed and lust. And the tale illustrates how the sovereignty of the land, represented by Goewin, is compromised by the sovereignty of individual desires. So the Gilfaethwy syndrome is something that places huge weight on the individual. It's about how I feel, what I want, and if my needs are not being met, I'm not going to be happy. And human beings in modernity, we spend an awful lot of time talking about ourselves, what we need, and yet the majority of us are dull as ditch water and as shallow as a puddle. But the inherent danger of the Gilfaethwy syndrome is the pathologizing of spirituality and the spiritual experience as only internal experiences, only internal, that are abstract and separate from the very anima of the earth itself. And in pathologizing spiritual experiences, we deepen that Gylfaethwy syndrome. So Arianrhod comes on the scene to fix that. And essentially that defilement, within that defilement, there's still a seed of hope that is planted within the goddess, but it's transferred by the power of Math's wand into Arianrhod. So I would argue culturally that what we see between Goewin and Arianrhod are two faces of the same goddess, and that she ultimately is pressing for the newborn child to be initiated by her powers of fate and fortune and destiny to recorrect and rebalance and bring order to that which has been disordered. And a huge clue to that, which has been missing from the English-speaking pagan communities until very recently, comes in the mystery of her name. So Arianrhod is what the majority of people might know her as, but I know her as Arianrhod. Arianrhod. Aranrhod. The letter I is missing from there. And in all of the text, throughout the mythologies, it is consistently spelt as Arianrhod. So if you were to look at Sioned Davies's Oxford University Press, the Mabinogion, which is the best translation available to modern audiences, you will see within that particular collection of work, she is always referred to as Arianrhod. So what's the difference? Arianrhod might mean the silver wheel, or a wheel that is turning and happens to be silver. Arianrhod, which I explore fully in my book, is very perplexing because that comes from the peculiarity of the Welsh language, a thing called mutations. And the name itself basically means an axle that causes the turning. An axle that causes a turning. Well, an axle, of course, is something that stabilizes two wheels, or maybe three wheels if you're thinking of something like a triskel in typical Celtic fashion. And that Arianrhod, as the majority of English-speaking people would know her, is still the same person, still the same being, is this sacred axle, this still point at the center of all activity, of all actions, that causes us to consider what is our still point. Where can we find our stillness, our silence, our center? Because when we don't find our stillness, our silence, our center, our wheels become unbalanced and there's the threat of them falling off. So Arianrhod isn't there to cause those wheels to spin. She's there to remind us of the still point, the axle. I find it fascinating that even the Old English word for axle is axle tree. Always comes back to trees, but I'm a druid and I'm obsessed with trees. But that axle, that still point, is, I think, one of the most vital messages within the functionality of Arianrhod, and how we can connect with her to find our stillness, to find our still point. And these sacred axles can be found all over the world. The Dharma chakra over in the Hindu religions is all about the maintaining of the axle at the center of that wheel of space and time, and the wheel of self. So she is the still point at the center of all things. She is that which causes us to consider that which is fated, that which is destined, and that which is also our fortune. Now, those three things are very different things, aren't they? Fate, you can think of fate as a web, fate as a thread and a path that is laid out before us. That destiny is how we engage with the moments within fate and how we shape them into meaning, and fortune as the random shenanigans and circumstantial aspects of life, luck and choice and the unpredictability. And Arianrhod has a hand in all of those, but her hand is there to constantly remind us, always look for your center, look for your stillness, look for your still point. So if for a moment, just to conclude, take a breath in and hold that breath in silence. for as long as you can, as I ask on your behalf as well. Lady of the silver wheel, star whose light will turn and heal, the axle tree to whom we're tied, guide our steps and be our guide. Teach us grace in all we do, balance wise and strong and true. Let us stand in stillness deep, while all the world spins in your keep. And when we look at the other elements of the bardic tradition of Wales, we can see those elements, those words that I've just spoken, expressed in the poetic renditions and the poetic love stories that our ancient bards wrote and included Arianrhod in there. Of these raging waters flowing around her fort, and yet at the heart of it, right at the centre, is she, the queen, the goddess, the axle tree. And she may seem antagonistic, because we always blame the forces around us, don't we, rather than take personal responsibility. But Arianrhod asks you, oh, honey, no. Stop, take stock, take responsibility, find your stillness, find your silence, find your axle, and let your wheels turn smoothly. So if you'd like to find out more, my book, Arianrhod, Celtic Goddess of Fate, Fortune and Destiny, will be released this summer by Moon Books, Pagan Portals, and I can't wait to share that with the world and with all of you. So thank you for listening for this 30-minute whirlwind roller coaster ride through something that I cannot do any justice to in 30 minutes. But I hope that that has somehow tickled and wetted your whistle in discovering more about Arianrhod. So with that, diolch yn fawr iawn i chi am wrando. Noswaith dda, good evening. Thank you very much for listening. And hopefully I shall see you somewhere along the journey.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I love the description of the myths and the difference between the spoken word, and I'd never thought about the pretty much trapping of them once they were written down.
Yes.
Hadn't thought of it from that perspective before. Yes, something to think about, definitely.
Thank you.
Right, let's get the gang on board, shall we? Right, we have Brett. Hello, welcome back. And Mhara. Right, we've got two. Here we go. Kristoffer back again. Thought we'd lost you then.
I just had to reach over that. I'd try and be graceful.
Oh, perfectly done. Wow, what a panel. What a panel. Thank you all so much for sharing your wisdom today. So much information. Fascinating, all of it. There have been questions.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, we've got questions. Let me just scroll back through. There's a lot of comments. Lots of lovely people commenting. Everyone enjoyed all of your talks. But let's go back to the first question as I scroll. Okay, this one is for Brett. Can we connect with Sabrina at any waterway in Wales?
Oh, can you hear me? Am I unmuted? Oh,
there you are.
Oh, saved you all the trouble of listening to my voice then. Oh, I've got to subject you to it again. I would say yes, personally speaking. I mean, water is that connective element that has helped facilitate transportation and communication between different people and different places. And so, I can definitely take on that mystical trajectory in order to encounter the goddess. But it generally depends on your gnosis, what you personally believe in. Because, of course, most waterways across Wales will be filled with either a spirit or of a presiding deity, and the last thing you want to do is go to someone's house to knock and ask for someone else. It can be quite considered rude. But yes, I suppose you can connect with her, because like I said, water is around us. She is a water deity, and so that's ubiquitous across the landscape. But it might be best, especially if you're a polytheist, asking the presiding deity or spirit of that waterway to connect with her. I myself, I've had multiple success of communicating with Havren everywhere, but I'm biased in that I've had Havren with me all my life, so I have that connection. But yeah, in short answer, yes, but in long answer, it depends, and just make sure you be respectful to any waterway that you have access to.
Yeah, you don't want to be upsetting any water spirits. That's not a good move.
Oh god, no, your house will be drowned in an instant.
You have been warned, people. Now, there's a general one here, actually, which is quite an interesting one. Valven says, I feel it is one and the same lady, the goddess that appears in many personalities in the Mabinogi. I guess that depends on how you view the goddess, but anyone want to take that one?
Anyone want to jump in? I can jump in.
Go for it.
I think certainly there are certain elements that seem to imply similar qualities. So you can see the quality of sovereignty playing out in Rhiannon, in Branwen, even in Blodeuwedd, and also in Arianrhod. So there's themes and elements of sovereignty that run through the Mabinogi for sure. And there's also some ambiguity as well, particularly for the two unnamed female figures in the first branch, the Queen in Annoven and also Teirnon's wife. And they're all described as wearing the same clothes as Rhiannon, but they're not named. So are they perhaps iterations of that same power, but in another worldly or in another location? Who knows? So I think that there's possibly threads that connect them, threads of sovereignty, threads of calumniation, threads of independence, threat of inner strength. And we can probably, in all likelihood, make connections between them. And yet the way that they're expressed within the Mabinogi also shows us that they each have a particular flavour of that quality that is expressed within each of their stories. There's something that makes them different, and yet there seems to be something that connects all of them.
Everyone's nodding.
I think part of what might connect them is that if they are, for example, sovereignty goddesses, but they are sovereignty of place. And so the land itself is going to have its own character in different places, different regions. And so that might account. So what connects them is their function, but they are performing that function in a particular location. And so that makes them separate, but what they do is collective.
Makes sense. So we have another question for Brett. You mentioned Sabrina in the USA. They want to know more.
It was a really strange fact that I found out about when I was writing my book. I didn't think it actually happened, but I researched it and it was absolutely splendid. But it took a very strange, peculiar spiritual turn. So Sabrina ended up in Massachusetts in 1857. It was a gift, basically. So Sabrina, as a 300-pound bronze statue, was gifted to the Amherst College in Massachusetts by Joel Hayden, who was the future lieutenant. And she sat at that college as almost its presiding deity, its presiding spirit. And this was an all-boys college, basically. And so you can imagine that having a half-naked statue with her tits bared out would cause a lot of controversy with the boys there, and it did. It started off with one of the boys playing a prank and dressing up in a bra that they stole from an all-girls school neighbouring. And then when he was reprimanded, he ended up taking an axe to the goddess's face.
Oh.
And this started off a huge tradition of the odds versus the even years, in which the odds years would fight with the even years in order to reclaim the goddess, to try and steal her away. And it got so violent to the point where they would shoot at each other, they fought each other, and the goddess was flung left, back and centre down a well, in a sausage factory in the River Connecticut. She was even flown across a football field in a helicopter. And she went missing for quite some time until she was eventually restored. But then you'll see in the spiritual tradition of the books that were written at the time, detailing this tradition, that she sat at the heart of the alumni. So as they celebrated in their victory meals, they would sing to her as this presiding deity who they loved and they adored. And later on, after the college became open and for mixed gender individuals to go and attend, she has now been seen to be a feminist icon for all that she endured. She survived for all the horrible kind of sexist things that she went through with all those boys doing those horrible things to her, but she still endured it as a symbol of strength and of sovereignty. And she's still the presiding deity over that place as well. So although it's not quite as spiritual or religious from a polytheistic tradition, it still shows how a goddess can be taken from her original location, be extrapolated and be taken and changed and to form new traditions in a place all the way across the sea. So that's how she ends up in Massachusetts, and she's still there today.
I wasn't quite expecting that. That's quite a story and quite a journey for Sabrina to make.
Yes,
I both love
absolutely.
and hate that story.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a very strange story, and what's interesting to read about is that you do see the people have these dreams where Sabrina does communicate with them, but it's a shame she didn't, slap him around the face for mistreating her. But they got lucky. They got lucky.
They might not have done. There might have been things that happened that we don't know about. I'm sure she
yes,
got
absolutely.
her. Yeah, I'm sure
Absolutely.
she got her. Yeah, definitely. Right, we've got one for Mhara. From Rebecca. Especially love the possibility that Bran and Branwen were originally the same person and wonder how the tale may have originally played out. Any thoughts?
So, to kind of put a dampen on it instantly, no thoughts, head empty. But essentially,
the end.
Yeah, the end. The idea that they are connected is obviously one that is presented by a guy called Patrick Ford, who is a Celtic scholar, and he wrote an essay on Branwen, and he puts forth this theory, and it is a theory. It's not something that has any backing behind it, not something that we can prove ultimately. And I'm sure it's an idea, a theory that would possibly anger some people because they're very attached to these deities. So to propose that perhaps they are one and the same would essentially put a damper on them as being seen as individual deities in their own rights. For me personally, I view things a little differently, because when we look at these stories within a Welsh context in particular, we have to remember that though these stories carry echoes of something far older than the written literary version of the stories that we have preserved now, we still have them within our hands when we read them from the books and such, within their medieval context. And so we have to remember that they probably would have been different, and once upon a time they would have been told orally. The stories would have been told by a bard, by a storyteller, by a cyfarwydd, a person who would have animated the story to life via their artistry and their expression with their storytelling skills. And so it's likely the stories never had a specific canon that they had to stay true to at that point. They would have changed from storyteller to storyteller and such. And so this theory intrigues me. I love it. I love the idea of it. And it does seem to ring of some truth to me, because of the fact that, yes, Branwen is a name that is rooted entirely in the indigenous language of Wales, obviously rooted from the older Brythonic language and such. But Bendigeidfran carries that Latin expression, so it implies that it's a later epithet that came onto him through that Latin influence. So it's easy to come to a conclusion that perhaps that title, that epithet, is probably younger than Branwen would be. But no, beyond that, I have no thoughts. But we can also state that, when we look at these gods, we have to consider that I look at them specifically through a Welsh context, where I don't particularly care so much as to whether or not we can confidently and 100% prove that they were ancient deities of the ancient world, because I'm not an ancient person of the ancient world. So to me, Bran and Branwen exist as two individual deities, but I do still like to play with this notion, especially because it connects Branwen specifically to an idea I hinted at in my talk, and then Jhenah also kind of hinted at a connection with that goddess with Rhiannon as well. We love to draw comparisons between deities, and of course usually when we talk about the Morrigan and possibly a Welsh version of the Morrigan, usually people turn to Rhiannon because her name means great queen and such, so there's that link there. But could it be that perhaps Branwen has a little tie to her as well? So I don't know, I just think it's a fun thing to consider and to think about, but it's not something I've really explored in great detail.
If I can just jump on that,
Please do. Yeah.
I think about Brana in the same way. And I think part of it is the martial aspect has been dropped because of when these stories were written down. A lot of Irish tales, since it was written down earlier, they reflect more of that Celtic warband kind of culture, especially the older ones, whereas we're in this medieval princely culture in the Welsh story. So while the Morrigan and similar sovereignty goddesses always have that protective, inciting function in Ireland, we just don't see it here, and that may be just where the story evolved to, and a function of when it was written down, that there was no, in memory, women who may have held that role or had that function of being a warrior.
Actually, speaking of the Morrigan, there's another question featuring the Morrigan. This one was actually directed to you, Jhenah. Do you think Branwen and Rhiannon could be part of a triad similar to the Morrigan?
I mean, I think we talked a little bit about it. I think what connects them is their function, that they are sovereignty goddesses, that they are manifestations of the land, and part of that work is to protect, right? I don't know. It is rare in where we see triplicities and divinities in most Celtic cultures. Sometimes that triplicity is translated as manifesting or magnifying the power of the divinity. So we have there's an example of Lugus on the continent, the triple, I can't say the plural of it, but the triple Lugus, it's not Lugus. Anyway, the triple Lugus, it's him, but it's multiplied in threes. The matres and the matronae, three mothers, not necessarily the same person, but perhaps the same person. So we're not entirely sure, but I think the triplicity, like we see in the Morrigan and the goddesses who connect her, it is rare, but it's something that we see a lot in new paganism today. That maiden mother crone, we want to make those distinctions and organize the goddesses in that way. But there's nothing that say that it isn't. But I think it's more a function of function than it is of a connection. They are sister-in-laws, so there is that piece. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts about that.
I mean, I'm always intrigued by the fact that sometimes it's very tempting, particularly for us modern pagans, to try and find triplicities as well. And that we seem to have a factory setting for trying to find triplicities. But I'm also fascinated by the idea of the sacred twinnings that occur within, particularly in, Welsh myth is what I study and work with. So we see these twinnings in the tale of Telydndru, but we certainly see this twinning happening in the second branch of the Mabinogi as well, with Evnishen and Dynifshen, polar opposites, are like almost in diametrical opposition to one another, yet both reliant upon one another. And then Bran and Branwen, regardless of the etymology of the the Latinized influences, they're still corvids, right? They're still corvids, and they both represent sovereignty. But they represent sovereignty from a different perspective. Branwen from a deeply feminine perspective, and Bran is this masculine king, warrior perspective of sovereignty. And I'm fascinated by that twinning and what we can glean from that twinning, rather than trying to find a triplicity. I think the twinning in itself is something that is deeply profound.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Thought about it like that. A good question now for anyone that wants to take it, or maybe even all of you, throwing it out there, from Sarah. People talk about connecting with these goddesses. How do you conceptualize the goddess? Do you see them as literal beings or as personifications of the natural landscape? Or all of the above?
There's a question. All of the above. It's interesting, isn't it? Because sometimes they can be perceived as hard polytheistic components, as in they're deities with their own agency. Sometimes some of the deities I work with have a soft polytheistic component. Some have euhemeristic, some have tutelary, genius loci, thought forms, archetypes, constructs. And I think it depends on the nature of the relationship that you had with them, and also the nature of the relationship that culture has had with them as well. So I've never been one to categorize the gods that Telydndru is a hard polytheistic component and that's all she can ever be. I've never conceptualized her as that. There's aspects to her that are deeply poetic, aspects to her that are through the process of apotheosis, and the same with all of the other deities as well. So I think that they can encompass all of these divisions that you find within polytheism, and also none of them. Because they're a paradox and they're a quandary, and they can be fickle.
Yeah.
They do it on purpose, I think. They totally defy any kind of entrapment. So I might even throw a spanner into the works and ask a question: why should we conceptualize them? Because even when we do, to any kind of binary definition or dichotomy, they will say, you know what, it's fine, I'll completely break it and appear in whatever way I want to be.
I got to turn around and say, oh, honey, no.
Yeah. They're beyond our comprehension. The best we can get is little glimpses.
I would agree with what Chris and Brett have said already, in that like it's difficult to try and come to a very clear like, are you this or are you that, in terms of how we view the deities, especially if you're somebody who does work with them on a regular basis or has a relationship with them in any way. Because I think once you start interacting with them, you start to realize that those boxes we try to place them into, they just fall apart and rip at the seams. And for years, I was a very kind of angsty polytheist pagan who wanted to be different, and I was very like, oh, these soft polytheists, psychologizing all of paganism and polytheism and their reverence to the gods. I'm not like that. I'm a hard polytheist. I see myself as this animist hard polytheist who's all the way over here. And then I started realizing that doesn't really work with the way in which I interact with the goddesses and the gods and the deities in general that are part and package of my life now, when as a pagan, as a polytheist. So one thing that I find really fascinating about Welsh tradition in particular is when we look at the myths and the stories that we've all spoken about this evening, one thing that I don't think gets spoken about enough, and it's something that Kristoffer kind of opened my eyes to a lot when I was doing the Anglesey Druid Order course, is the fact that sometimes these beings, these entities, these characters in these stories, they represent an aspect of the human condition itself, so what it means to be human, and that is expressed in the most obvious hiding place possible, their names. And I can't really pin it to any of the goddesses we've spoken about this evening, but you can see it quite clearly with, if you look at the first branch of the Mabinogi, you've got Pwyll, who is the consort of Rhiannon, and their son Pryderi. Their names literally mean caution and wisdom, which is Pwyll, caution, wisdom, prudence, that kind of idea. And then their son, Rhiannon and Pwyll, when they are in a union together and they create a child, they give birth to a son who is literally called Anxiety, Pryderi. So it's we have this strange thing where if you read the story with that in mind, with the idea that oh, we're not talking about Pwyll the person, we're talking about caution, the idea of caution as a trait that you must learn if you're going to be an effective ruler. Similarly, Pryderi, if you're talking about anxieties and the way in which we associate ourselves with our anxiety and sometimes make decisions based on anxiety, as opposed to coming from a place that is more enlightened and less rooted to something that is, at the end of the day, something that is holding us back and pulling us back, or sometimes can throw us into situations we don't want to be in. And you see these characters reflect those ideas quite clearly. And then we have some characters like Kikva, who Pryderi ends up marrying, who have strange names. So Kikva means the meat place, the place of meat, which is in and of itself what on earth are they talking about there? But you can kind of see, possibly, if you interpret it in some ways, is it saying that anxiety is married to the body, to the physical body, and is not of the spirit, not of something beyond us, but is something that we experience physically, and that sometimes can be either a hindrance or sometimes a help as well, to shove us into situations or to help us from going into situations that we might be harmed in. So sometimes I look at these stories and I'm like, can I look at them as a purely hard polytheist if they're also teaching us the values of what it means to be human? And if I tried to draw that line in the sand of saying, no, I'm a hard polytheist, I refuse to look at them in that way, am I then missing something? So I no longer class myself as a hard or a soft polytheist. I class myself as somewhere in the middle, a wibbly wobbly polytheist, or a semi polytheist, if we're going to go for that phallic way of hard and
I
soft.
call myself a squishy polytheist. You're welcome to use that as well.
Mara and Brett have both said something really interesting there. Mara mentioned boxes, and when you try and put them into boxes, what you find are the spanners that Brett mentioned. The boxes are just full of spanners. Be thrown into the works and muddle it all up.
That all makes perfect sense.
I'd like to add too. I think developing a relationship in whatever way makes sense to you at any time comes first. So if it's through the literature, if it's through the land, if it's through the culture, and so on. But what I found is this, and the Mabinogi teaches us this, that that the other world is easily entered into, right? Sometimes you come upon it unawares, and it's in spaces and places of liminality. And I think I've learned from Cerridwen as well that mastery of a thing also allows the other world through, right? When you go into if you're such a refined musician and you're playing with other people and you're playing off of each other and you're improvising, you're not thinking, there's no conscious thought. It just comes through you. You know enough to be able to allow it to express itself through you. And so what I found is that wherever I either am in the presence of a liminality or create it in some way, like the liminality of a pen to a paper, liminality of entering into a ritual space or going out into the sacred landscape or meditating in your bath, all of those places where we create those spaces that allow that to come through. I think the divine or these divinities in particular can come through those things. And I think they speak to us in the language that we speak. Perhaps that language is the language of art and of color and the science behind that, to see the metaphor and interplay in there. I think it can teach us about that. It can teach us about physiology. It can teach us about astronomy. It can teach us about our own processes. What are we bringing to it? Where are we arriving where those two places can meet so that the other world can come through and speak to us and express itself to us where we are? So I think we can meet it where it is. We can create those liminalities. Sometimes those liminalities arise unexpectedly. But I think that when we're open to that the divine speaks to us in the way that we can hear and what we need to see in any given moment. So I think they're all of the things. It just depends on what language they're using to speak to us through. So whether it's metaphor or psychology, or I love the idea, Kristoffer, especially because I do a lot of that, how can their story help me understand myself and my situation, or the process that I need to go through? How do I follow that mythic map to be in better relationship with myself, with them, with the world? But I love the idea of how it pushes forward, how to continue this process, how it can teach us about. I think it's not a coincidence that, especially, I feel like, especially outside of Wales, that consciousness of these divinities are increasing at this time. That the whole neo-pagan movement has come at this particular time. It's meeting a particular cultural need, and I think that as we're coming into relationship, we'll be able to sing their stories in new ways again to bring that back. I think that was the beauty of that oral tradition, because it allowed the people within to find what they needed in that moment. It could rise to the occasion, and I think that that's what's happening here. So. I think establishing a relationship first is important, so you know who and where and wow and how. I don't even know any of those words with, but I think you understood what they were supposed to rhyme with. But then to be open to allow them to speak to us in the spaces and in the places that we need most to hear them.
There's actually a question here that kind of follows on from that. Garrett says, would you agree that the gods purposely break the boxes we tried to put them in just to inspire us to think bigger than that?
No, they do it to piss us off. Pardon the language.
And there's your answer.
I think any connection that we have with the numinous, with that which is ethereal, is always going to be challenging. Mm-hmm. And will break down barriers and break the boxes that we try and place them in. But I think that ultimately being in relationship with any of these deities isn't being in relationship for the sake of relationship. It's the quality and value and meaning of that relationship, which I think is important. And how we might, like Jhenah was describing, in those liminal times, in those liminal moments when we stand in the presence of Cerridwen when we feel inspired. You might be watching a movie or listening to a bard or a musician, and you suddenly feel inspired. You are standing in the presence of the worldly influence, of that force that we would call Cerridwen, the influence of Awen, and that person is in the stream of it, and you just happen to be caught in its event horizon. And it's the quality of those relationships, I think, not only break those boxes, but cause us to look at how the virtues of those deities that we're in relationship with are reflected and expressed in our own living. And that the way we move through the world, I hope, would then be a reflection of the virtues we see as having deep value and worth in them, and how we express them as living bodies of flesh.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's really fundamental for the relationship with yourself and a deity to be a continuous stream of inspiration and reciprocity, because if it doesn't, it stagnates. And no matter how many times a person can read the same myth relating to a specific deity, there'll always be something that you can miss and relate it to in the modern day or in your own personal life.
Yeah, definitely. I liked your first answer better, Brett.
I have to be diplomatic. I can't be potty mouth all the time.
Brilliant. Actually, there's a question about the English translation on the triads. They missed the name of it.
Yes, so the book is edited and translated by Rachel Bromwich, and it's called The Triads of the Island of Britain. So it's widely available wherever books are sold, and it's a valuable resource for anybody who is engaging with Welsh Celtic myth, and particularly with the bardic tradition of Wales. The Triads of the Island of Britain, Rachel Bromwich.
I will add to that, to what Kristoffer's saying as well, that some people, I've noticed this, have trouble with the Triads by Rachel Bromwich because they look at it on Amazon or Waterstones or whatever they're looking at, and the title is bilingual. So they see Trioedd Ynys Prydain, which is the Welsh title of it, and they get a bit like, oh no, that's Welsh, I can't read that. It is the right one, I promise.
It's the right one. It's in English.
I will preface as well and say that if you do buy it, be warned, it is a thick tome of a book. Take regular coffee breaks, have a cigarette, have a glass of wine, because it's a very heavy read, but worth it. But...
Don't try reading it from cover to cover.
Oh no,
that'll rot your brain quicker than psilocybin.
Noted. We've got a question here from Rosemary. Written versus oral history of mythical culture. Which country has more of the actual written history that wasn't lost over time?
But as in
interesting.
As in country or any country?
Either. Does anyone know the answer?
Well, I would say probably, if a country that actually has written mythological records that is significantly older than Indo-European stuff, it would probably be Hindi.
Oh,
it would be, the Vedas, and because that was all written in Sanskrit, so it's significantly older than the Celtic languages, but it's also influenced the Celtic languages. Mm-hmm. So I would say the Hindu myths would be the oldest, but I might be wrong, but that's only because I've been there and kind of chatted to them.
No, that makes sense. We have another one here. An observation. Feel like the hard lines to define what the gods are comes from the Abrahamic monotheistic viewpoint. Do you agree with that?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah.
Tick.
Because we're programmed by it, aren't we? That's to the majority of people, particularly now, people over 35 years old who live in the Western world. Our factory setting was Christianity. That's changed in the last 20, 25 years. We now do have hereditary druids, pagans, and witches.
Yeah.
Whereas in the 90s, it was just a fantasy, But now we do. So I think, it's our factory setting for a lot of us.
Yeah. And talking
And I
of
think that's
factory settings, sorry.
Go ahead.
Speaking of factory settings as well, I think going back to that question about the older written sources, what older written sources we have, I think we have a tendency, because of the culture that we're all brought up in, to value written sources above oral traditions and such as well. So we tend to have this obsession with trying to find the oldest, most arcane, most ancient source that we can find, that we can pinpoint, to this very kind of narrow idea of what we consider to be like true and appropriate. And it's very much influenced by like the academic institution and the way that our history, our philosophies, our everything is very rooted in the idea that if it's not written down, then it doesn't exist. And we see that a lot with Welsh culture, where things, if they were not written down, and specifically if they weren't translated into English, then they're of no value and therefore they don't exist. So it's important as well, if we're breaking down illusions and coming to a more kind of nuanced view of these things, that we also challenge that, the idea that something being old and ancient and written down, or something being existent in a literary tradition, is more authentic or more valuable in any way than an oral tradition that would have evolved and changed with the people. I would challenge that view as well.
That's sort of like of a stream of
for a fight.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt the fight.
Jhenah.
Well, just that I like to refer to a stream of tradition. I mean, I think it is hard when there aren't, like when you look at some polytheistic ancient cultures who wrote down their myths, the people who were actively in worship of these divinities recorded their rites and their psalms and all of those things, and to not have that during the pre-Christian time in Celtic traditions can be difficult, because then what do we pull from? What do we evolve? So I think that this idea of a stream of tradition allows there to be, nothing is more right than the other. One is an evolution of another, and we're at the where the water has flown to this moment. Flowed, where the water, to which the water has flowed to this moment, we're inheriting all that has come before. And sure, we want to go as deep and as back as we can to get the full picture. But as we participate in that stream, the stream continues to flow through us. And I think it's important for us to be rooted in the past, in the culture, and to understand the ways in which things have changed over time and why, so that we can pick that up and move forward with it with that full understanding. Now, I think that our evolution as a movement, as a neo-pagan movement, has gone through that as well. I mean, I think if you look at the books that were available when I got into paganism in the mid-'80s versus now, I mean, there were a lot of things that were said and accepted as truth and just passed on from one author to another. And then, things that we thought we knew about Celtic traditions or particular deities. But as we've grown, so our understanding has grown. So we have to shed some of those things. Like I think it was Brett was saying, we're meant to be in dynamic relationship with the divine. And if you're not growing in your understanding or deepening that connection, changing your mind over time, admitting the pieces that don't fit anymore and releasing them, just because you've held that belief for 20 years doesn't mean that in light of new information or personal experience that you can't shift to another place. So I think that we need to be able to shed our preconceived notions, because that's a reflection of our understanding and connection and relationship to divinity. And I think it's the same for our collective movement. And I just want to add one more thing to what Mhara said, and about the idea of written sources. I know for myself that as someone who's engaged in study, it has been frustrating to be limited to just those materials that have been translated into English, which is part of the reason why I've been studying Welsh. But the fact that more native people like Kristoffer and yourself are translating materials that had not been able to be, I mean, I'm appreciative of the accessibility of that. And I think that is part of that expansion. I don't think it's not, I know for me, it's like, please translate it into English, as opposed to, well, if it's not translated into English, then it may not be of worth to me. But that, I think that's an enormous service to us all when those things happen. But also learn the language so you can read it too.
I mean, I could throw in another analogy as well, particularly that the majority of us have ever mentioned or talked about deities, archetypes from the Mabinogi. And the Mabinogi are branches. It's a tree, and it's not 4 trees, it's a single tree. And when you look at Welsh tradition, Welsh culture in particular, we're obsessed with trees. Even the meaning of derwydd, druid, is tree. Our alphabet, or wyddor, means the language of trees. The word for encyclopedia is Gwyddionadur, which basically means the trees told me. We've got all these peculiarities in reference to trees in our culture, particularly when it comes to our myths. Our myths is an entire forest of different trees, but the original tree that those myths came from doesn't exist anymore. It's seeded and grown saplings in a forest that no longer resembles the forest that stood 1,000 years ago. But that forest is still alive. And we are the children of that forest. We are the new grove. And I think when we consider the myths as elements of trees, which were so important, particularly to the Druids and still to Druids today, that there is a profundity in that the original tree has well gone. It's vanished, but its children continue as the new forest of myth. And I think that gives us permission to be able to take from that forest new seeds and new fruits so that we seed the future with the wisdom that we are trying to be in accordance with.
Yeah, as someone who started the paganism journey way before the internet it even was a thing. Yeah, it's fluid. I think it has to be fluid, doesn't it? It has to be, yeah. The stuff that I learnt originally,
Where we could only access stuff in the back of the Exchange and Mart. Do you remember those
That's
days?
it, yeah. Oh, things have changed. I think our own journeys are fluid anyway, aren't they? So it all has to fall into it. Jhenah, there's a request for you here. The prayer that you spoke, is it in one of your books?
It might be in Rhiannon. I can look while we're here. But
this will be on replay, so you can.
It'll be on replay, right? You can grab those, screenshot them.
Yeah. You missed a trick there. You have to buy Jhenah's book to find it. Actually, I have a question. If you are outside of Wales, if you've never been to Wales, but you are drawn to the Welsh deities, where do you start? How do you make that connection if you aren't actually on the land?
Who wants to go?
I'll just speak from the outsider's perspective, and then those of you who are the
good idea.
So for me, I think there are many different ways of entry, but for me, the strongest was through tale, through story, through myth. And it is in the study of myth and coming into relationship with myth, and then my desire to understand it more, that I understood and had to enter through culture, myth as an outgrowth of culture, but you have to have that cultural context to get there. I see things like studying the Welsh language, learning Welsh poetry forms, carving love spoons, song, dance, any aspect of culture, or I find that to be, for me, that was an important connection in. I did it as a devotional act to show that I want to learn more about the culture. I want to practice aspects of culture because I'm outside of the culture. And I did it as a devotional act to these deities that I was building relationship with. And I also found that pilgrimage to these places, because, I mean, again, well, I guess there was internet, but I remember it was me and 3 other sisters. We had a copy of the Mabinogi and an OS map, and we went out into the landscape to find the places connected to the goddesses and gods that we were working with. And that was so profound for me because it just lives in the landscape. And I know that that's not something that everyone can do, but even just looking at photos of places can be important. But if you can go on pilgrimage, to be in that space, to talk to the people who are local. I've learned so many folkloric pieces from people who live in the landscape where these myths occurred that I've never seen written down in other places. And so it just, it's a joy, but I think we have to listen, we have to hear, we have to arrive, we have to meet that moment. And that really shifted things in a deeper way. And then, yeah, so I think for me, it's three things. It's study, it's devotion, and it's practice. But I think the tale for me, it was the most powerful way in. And then culture as part of that devotional piece from the outsider's view.
Who wants to take it next?
It's a very
You're all
difficult
smiling.
thing for, especially I think for Mhara, Brett, and myself. We've been immersed in these stories from birth, and we have no idea what it's like to not be in a position where they were not a part of our lives. And I've always found it very humbling, very surprising to travel the world and meet people who know of the deities that I'm connected to. And to begin with, I found that quite startling. I'm like, oh my gosh, how do you know about that? And of course, it was through paganism, through neo-paganism. And my advice to anybody who's trying to develop a relationship with the Welsh deities is, first and foremost, like Jhenah said, study, look them up, read the books, but also speak to us, talk to us, talk to the Welsh, speak to the Welsh. We're always we like to talk, so we're always willing to have a chat and have a go at the language as well. I think whenever anybody has a go at the language, it causes a shift in your perspective and deepens your understanding of not only the cultural struggles and triumphs of the peoples who guarded this material, because I think it's also important that as Welsh people that we recognize we don't own this material. We don't own it. We may have safeguarded it and we may have helped its progression through time, but we don't own it. This isn't a question of possession. It isn't a closed culture. We love to share the wisdoms that are available to other people from our culture. And I think we all benefit when culture is shared that way, in a way that is appreciative and not appropriative.
I think as well, even getting involved with the mundane things can be such a beautiful devotional way in order to connect with your ancestry or to any kind of aspect of Cymru. So I have a very... if anyone sat me down and started to talk about where I come from and my upbringing, my God, you had to pull up a chair, it'd be hours. I wouldn't be able to shut off. Because I grew up in the intermediary between two different places. So as coming from a very mixed Welsh and English family and being passed over like a bloody cheese platter beyond the border, left, right and centre towards England and Wales, I grew up not necessarily knowing my identity. And even though I grew up in Wales, I didn't necessarily go to Welsh school. So I didn't grow up speaking Cymraeg. I had to learn that later on. But I think even as part of my pagan and my religious practice, even getting involved with the most mundane things. So, looking at I say mundane, it's quite turbulent, but looking at the political structures of what's going on in Wales, what's going on with the everyday modern people can help open avenues that you may not necessarily have seen before. Because I think a lot of people who want to connect with Wales on the outside, even someone like me who's, been embraced by it, but also on the outside at the same time, simultaneously, there is a tendency to sometimes romanticize a little bit. And although this landscape is beautiful and it's filled with, beautiful mythology that you can connect to, Game of Thrones, I think people can take that just a little bit too far and see that, it is a real place. And even involving yourself in the more beautiful things that are more mundane, championing the rights of Cymru, there's things to do with independence, that in its way can help deepen your connection both to the deities of this landscape who represent within the modern day as well. One of the ways I personally involved myself in order to draw research was to research the political structures that were going on during the Norman invasion. So one of the things I absolutely love to talk about is Owain Glyndwr. And Mhara will preface this and say that, I talk about him a lot. I adore him and his history. And when you look at him as the last King of Wales or last Prince of Wales, depending which perspective you want to take on that, when you see his actions, such as the tripart indenture, how he wanted to move the boundaries, when you start embracing outside the boundaries of spirituality and you see more into the rooted humane aspects, that's when you see more magical things erupt. So, for example, Owain Glyndwr, you delve more into the prophecies of Darogan, or, the prophesizing tradition, or you see the connections fizzle out into landscapes which may not necessarily be part of Wales today, but were before previously, and you start to discover more cultural aspects and more different divinities that lay outside of Wales that still scream to be heard. They're still there. Amaohi, they're still here. And so, yeah, getting involved with the mythology, beautiful, but also just the mundane things, championing what's going on in Wales right now, getting more involved with the modern day movements, the media, the young people, the youth, talking to the elderly people who keep hold of these stories. That's another way to connect, I think, and that's what's helped me as well in my own identity.
I think I would also add to that, and this is possibly a controversial thing to say, so I hope I don't offend anyone in saying this, but something that I've kind of started exploring lately and really trying to express to people, especially because I'm the type of person now who, luckily, I'm very privileged that I'm somewhat popular. Woo! Might break out into Wicked and say that now. So I get invited.
Understatement.
I get invited to events and conferences and all sorts of beautiful things that are happening now across the world, because I've also been to America to do it. But I've been to Scotland, I've been to various parts of England, I've been all over England delivering talks and discussing these myths and these stories. And almost everywhere I go, I get people coming up to me, except in America. This doesn't happen in America. The Americans don't have this problem, weirdly. But a lot of English people, Scottish people, Cornish people, they will come up to me and they will go, I love your work and I love everything that you do, but I'm not Welsh, so I have no connection to it. I can't connect to it. It's not the same. I wish it was, but it's not anything to do with me. It's got nothing to do with me in my life. And I always kind of struggle with that, because if you actually read a lot of our myths, our stories, and our older poetry, and you delve into some of these figures and characters, a lot of these stories, a lot of these characters, they are rooted in a landscape that today, by today's borders, by today's definitions, are not in Wales. Like, so many of these characters, their stories take place in places that we would class today as England, as Scotland, as Cornwall, and they're part and package of our culture because their stories have, as it happens, been preserved in the Welsh language. So, of course, Wales now preserves those stories and basically accepts them as part and package of our culture and our ancestry. But this is something that people beyond the confines of today's modern border can very much feel a connection to, as you probably saw from Brett's talk. I grew up on the Isle of Anglesey, right at the very tippy top of the north of Wales. I was very privileged to have grown up in an area that was predominantly a Welsh-speaking area. Over 70% of the people in that area when I was growing up spoke Welsh as their first language. That number's dipped a bit nowadays for reasons, but it's still quite high. It's still over 50%. It's still over half of the population there speaks Welsh as their primary language. But, nowadays, I don't live on Anglesey. I live in Chester. I live on the borders. So though I'm technically only literally a nose hair away from Wales, I am, by definition, living in England. And I remember when I first moved here, I had this sense of almost identity loss, where I felt like I can't connect to myself, my identity, my Welshness anymore, because I'm living in an English landscape. Forgetting that surrounding me in this area are echoes of those mythologies, of those stories, of those poems, those poets and bards and those figures from our history. They all have associations to places like this one. And not just here, because this is on the border, but all over what we now refer to as England, Scotland, Cornwall, these areas. So even if you do not live specifically in Wales, it's important to acknowledge as well, I think, that these stories, they have an echo and an association with the past of this landscape long before various invaders came in, long before it was separated by these man-made borders that we've created. This was an island that was connected by language and culture, and that culture and language was Brythonic, which is essentially Common Brythonic was the ancestor of Welsh. So yes, the Welsh and the Cornish might be essentially the descendants of that ancient culture, and therefore we are now the caretakers caretakers of those cultural things, but this is still your heritage if you live on what we refer to as the main island of Great Britain nowadays. If you live in Scotland, England, Wales, Cornwall, any of those areas, then these stories relate to you in some way. So it's important that we acknowledge that as well, even though that might be a bit controversial and I might have offended a few Welshies in saying that.
Oh no, he still buried Brown's head in London. He wasn't buried in Llangefni.
Yes.
We buried his head in London because it was Ynys Môn, as we called it, the island of the mighty, was Britain.
I'm pleased, actually, Kristoffer, when you said about people trying the language, because I will admit I was terrified today of saying the goddess names and pronouncing them properly in case I offended. And I wonder if that a lot of people feel that, and that's perhaps why, like you say, Mhara, I'm not Welsh, I don't live in Wales, and do you think it frightens people off?
I think it frightens people, but I think the answer is fairly simple as well. And I just tell people, you've got one of these. No?
Oh, yes.
Whack us up on Facebook and use the voice function and just go, "Oi, Kristoffer, how do I say this word?" And I'll just send you a voice message straight back. No. Yes. We have the technology, but I think people are, I don't know, they're either shy or they feel they're going to put people out. Please don't ever think that. We're here. We want to help. Reach out.
Brilliant.
And we'll help you.
That is very good to know. I think probably the last question, because we are getting short on time. Do you think the gods have a hand in the increase in Welsh learners and Welsh culture?
Yes. Oh gosh, I'll take that one quickly first, and then I would be interested to hear everyone else's thoughts as well. But when I talk about the gods, especially when questions such as "are they really gods" come up, which I touched on briefly in my presentation, this notion that, these stories, they're rooted to a medieval literary tradition, and nowhere in the stories does it ever say that they are gods or anything like that. We have to remember that the history of why these manuscripts were written, why these stories were put onto the written format, was because the people of Wales, especially the nobility of Wales, were starting to realise that things were changing. The culture and landscape of this region was changing, and the native inhabitants of this landscape were being pushed into the corners of this landscape, and as such, the language was starting to deplete as well. And so they thought, well, we have to preserve our stories, our poetry, our traditions. So literally the only reason we have them written down is because people were like, we need to save these, we need to preserve these for future generations. The bardic tradition, which entities such as Telydndru are deeply associated with, was instrumental in carrying the Welsh culture and language into the modern age through the mists of time, bringing us into what we are today. And we still have echoes of that bardic tradition even carrying forth in the things that we do today at the National Eisteddfod, or when we go and we sing and we recite poems and we join our choirs and such. It echoes of that aspect of our culture, which in turn relates us back to Telydndru. So I think these characters, these entities, these deities that are woven into our stories, they essentially became the channels by which our culture was carried for a long time. They became cultural icons that we looked to and saw ourselves and went, you know what? We've got some really cool things going on here, and maybe these stories, this language, these songs, these poems deserve being taken through the mist of time, despite all of those occasions where certain people, certain figures, certain influential royals and such tried to stamp us out. In spite of all that, we carried it forward because we knew they were important. And at the heart of that need to carry it forward and keep it alive and keep it burning were these entities, were Rhiannon, Blodeuedd, Branwen, Rhiannon. They were there constantly reminding us of who we are. And I think a lot of people now are starting to realise that they need to learn Welsh because they want to connect with these characters and these stories and these traditions. Almost everyone I meet in my life nowadays says, I joined Duolingo to learn Welsh because I want to know more about the Mabinogi, because I want to connect to Rhiannon, because I want want to sing the songs of Ceridwen and Gwyn ap Nudd and such. And I think that's absolutely beautiful. So I would say definitely they have a hand in helping increase the number of Welsh learners and the interest in Welsh culture. But I don't know if anyone else agrees.
Yeah, I agree very much, because I think that people are also acutely aware of the fact that Wales is colonised. We're colonised by the English powers, and we have been for centuries. And because we're white, nobody thinks that we're a colonised nation where our language has suffered. I saw a comment earlier on of someone saying that in South Wales, they were not exposed to the Welsh language as such. I carry a patronym which is anglicised. It's Hughes. It should be Huws. Shame was brought into the language by the powers of imperial England. And those powers are still there. And I think, especially within paganism, people are aware of that. And when we move to try and decolonize our paganism, learning the language and, as Brett said, learning about the real struggles that those people have in those nations is a really important thing. And I would hasten to add that perhaps the huge upsurge in interest in the Welsh language is probably coming from pagans.
Yeah.
In fact, if I may add, Duolingo has several questions and includes language around paganism, around Archdruid, around the Eisteddfod, gods, goddesses, people in their little characters are pagan and practice paganism. And so it's kind of interesting that they have a little unit, and there are a bunch of...
All hail the mighty deity Owen and his mighty panas.
That's
And
so
Duolingo.
funny, but really cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
Certainly, mythology and paganism was my portal of entry into wanting to study. So just as a personal piece. And, I love the idea that supporting the language, knowing that it's kind of a revolutionary act, right? To, because the Welsh language underwent so much repression, even into modern times, into living memory, that it is kind of it's a political as well as a devotional act to learn this language. I think it's a powerful thing, and I think the gods see that in devotion.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
well
Just to add my own little personal perspective on that as well. So obviously I grew up next to Sabrina, and we were told the most popular tale obviously was the Lochranus tale. But then when I started learning into her history and delving into it more, there were those Welsh aspects that were so heavily neglected. And the more I sought out my relationship with Havrin or Sabrina, the more she herself pushed me towards those aspects to reveal the more Welsh aspects. And I think going into divinity or relationship with divinity from a Welsh perspective, it's inescapable. It's inescapable. And I think to be part of that relationship is to, be embraced by the language, no matter how much you use. And all of it is, it's cultivation. Even if knowing one word or two words, just saying diolch at the end of your sentence when you're speaking to people, it all helps. It's all devotion. Even if it's just having that one word or two or adding to it in your vocabulary.
Brilliant. It has been fascinating. I have a head full of information, which is going to take some time to process. This is on replay if anybody missed any of it, and you can watch it back again on YouTube or on Facebook. Thank you to all of you experts. It has been brilliant. We've had so many comments. If you want to have a look back at them, just thanking you all and telling you all how wonderful you are. And so they should. Just thank you. And thank you to everyone that's watched and listened. It's been an absolute pleasure. Take care, everyone. Thank you so much.
Diolch yn fawr. Nos da.
Diolch.
Diolch yn fawr.
Thank you.
Good night.